Okay, looks like we are live now. So welcome to the second day of our Joint Agriculture Committee meeting. We have lots of good topics to discuss, so we'll go ahead and start with the roll call.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bouchard.
Here.
Senator Cost.
Here.
Senator Moniz.
Here.
Senator Steinmetz.
Here.
Representative Blake.
Here.
Representative Clausen.
Here.
Representative Haley.
Here.
Representative Henderson. I think you're muted. Representative Henderson.
Here. Not be joining us today. Listening.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Simpson.
Here.
Representative Tass.
Here.
Representative Winter.
Here.
Co-Chairman Boner.
Here.
Co-Chairman Hunt.
Here.
All committee members are present, Mr. Chairman.
All right, well, thank you, Kayla. I appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get started, I think it's important to maybe, before we get to the agenda items, to have a little bit more discussion on one of the bills that we drafted. That'll be coming up very soon for our meeting here in a couple weeks. And there's quite a bit of discussion about how best to help ag producers. And just wanted to at least give my thoughts as to how we're going to move forward on that, just because I think there may have not been a whole lot of clarity as to exactly what we were going to do, and certainly look forward to discussion from the committee members. So in my mind, there's two steps that we need to take. First of all, understand exactly what the rules allow us to do under the CARES Act. I think there's a little bit of confusion on that. We've been focused. I think it's good to point out that there has to be an actual loss demonstrated, and that's been the method that we've used so far. But then you contrast that with the federal USDA provisions. I'm not sure how much of a element that is, and certainly with what the governor of Nebraska has done with those direct distributions. Clearly, that's would contradict what the process that we've taken so far. So I think that it's important to get clarity on those rules from our staff and before we move forward, and also reach out to other legislators would be the second part. Make sure that whatever we come up with is going to have legs once we get to the session. I think Representative Simpson brought that up. We have to be cognizant of that. I think sometimes we do kind of get focused solely on what's best for producers here. Maybe that's going to fly when it gets to the whole body. Maybe it won't. I mean, my goodness, we have members of the legislature who are trying to tell us whether we turn our cameras on and off in the middle of this meeting. So we have to be aware of all the hurdles that any bill draft will face before it becomes law, and so we'll use that basic process and obviously keep within. There's several ideas that we had as to what the bill draft would look like, but in terms of procedure, how I would plan to proceed in getting that bill draft going. That was the general idea that I had. And then of course we could have perhaps multiple options available to the committee for our consideration in a few weeks here. So that I just want to hopefully add a little bit of clarity, at least in terms of the process that we would take as chairman in getting that bill draft ready for you. And just would be looking for any input as to what we should do moving forward. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was a little troubled by that, as you obviously all probably saw the email I sent you last night. And I think that's a great way to go forward. I would also maybe put out there for the committee's thoughts to maybe form a working group with some ag industry folks and try to really start hammering out how we can best help producers and what that looks like. And with that frequently asked questions guidance document put out by the Treasury, I think there's another key component to that, and that is the fact that when your customer base dries up and there's a lack of demand for your product, that is definitely covered in there. So how we integrate that into the bills, we have obviously food security looks like a huge part of this. And so as we proceed forward, a working group might be great to get something done and really hammered out before the 15th so that we can be ready for the special session, because I'm of the opinion, even though some of the losses are hard to quantify right now, we have producers who have fat cattle that are standing in the feedlot that they can't sell. And so that's a real-time loss. It affects their cash flow. It affects whether they can get a loan next year to operate and all sorts of other things. And so those are some of my thoughts as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, anybody else? Senator Moniz.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was thinking this morning as we addressed this whole issue yesterday, we can't be the first ones who've been discussing this. I would think all the surrounding states around us are dealing with something very similar. I'm not sure what the forum would be to reach out to those folks, but that may be helpful as we try to put something together here.
I agree. We can, I think that's something we could ask of staff to take a quick survey and see what's going on in states other than Nebraska. We heard about that yesterday, but certainly I agree with you. There's, we can't be the only ones kind of weighing these issues.
So I'm guessing that's telling Kayla that we need some information from the surrounding states.
Yeah, I feel comfortable. Kayla, if you're okay with that, and I was going to send you an email, basically just saying what I already said. But the only other thing I would add, and it kind of gets to the question we talked about, and that there's a provision actually in the first bill we passed, not the one that the Business Council has been primarily focused on, that to help ag producers. And I think that ball's kind of in the governor's court right now, and so we'll certainly be able to reach out to him, especially, yeah, I mean, we've heard talk about there being a special session in June or July, but frankly, I'm not sure if that's, there's other considerations. A lot of us are, or some people are going to be, running for re-election. All of our House members, about half of our Senate members. Frankly, this is a citizen legislature. I'm a little concerned that we've kind of lost sight of that. So there's no guarantee that there's going to be a special session before August. So I think it's important to also reach out to the governor's office and see what they're planning on doing. After all, this is an emergency that's best suited for the executive to handle, in my opinion. But so I'd add that to the list, and I can do that personally. We don't need staff to do that. I reach out to the governor's office. So any further discussion on that? Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just agree with that. Our governor intimately knows the situation that our producers are going through, and he's got to have a good feel for it as well. So I think it's a good idea.
Okay, Kayla, do you have any input on that? Is that sound reasonable, especially given the compressed time frame?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you answered my question as I was thinking it. As the committee was discussing about reaching out to other states, my thought was, is that a directive to staff? And then you said yes, so that's great. That's no problem. We can definitely reach out and see kind of how other states are dealing with ag producers specifically.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Any further discussion on this topic, kind of a carryover and I guess follow up and a little bit of clarity after what we, the last thing we did yesterday? Okay, seeing none, obviously I kind of consider all of us the working group, and we'll be in contact with the whole committee. And obviously we'll be hearing from the folks who represent producers as well. So we'll be working in close contact with them, and we certainly heard a lot of good information yesterday. So appreciate everybody's input. So that being said, we are on our 8:40 agenda item, invasive species. We have the governor's office up first. Joe Budd is the policy director that covers agriculture. He's been heading up the governor's invasive species initiative. Been a group of a significant amount of experts that has been tackling this question of how to best manage invasive species in the state. Obviously, we had a few bills that dealt with that last session, but there's still a lot to do to include incorporating the work of this initiative into whatever legislation that they recommend. So that being said, we're getting an update from Joe with the hope and expectation that by August they'll have something a little bit more final to present, but it's good to get an update and for the committee's consideration for that August meeting. So Joe, welcome to our Zoom meeting. Good to see you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assume everybody can hear me, hopefully. So you should have actually four documents from our office that kind of outline where we're at with the GISI, or the Governor's Invasive Species Initiative. And I would just provide you a little bit of an update since the May letter, given that the joint ag meeting was moved initially. So a little bit of background: the GISI was launched in October of 2019. It's 32 and now 33 to 35 people that have all come together, kind of two different teams, one a policy team, one a technical team, to look at both sides of that invasive species equation. And this is really to address terrestrial invasive species. So we don't get into aquatics, we don't get into some of the other things that are out there. And it's not just limited to, say, cheatgrass or medusa head or ventonata. But really, the teams have been working. We've met in person a number of times. Our initial challenge was the weather. It seemed like every time that we scheduled a meeting, we had some bomb cyclone that came through, or snow squall, I think was the term that they enjoyed using so often this last year. But initially, we were hoping to have a report done by mid-May. Obviously, that didn't happen. COVID not only shut things down for us, but it exacerbated the issues that we had with the weather earlier in the year. And really, this is all based on a letter that the governor sent to these teams that outlined 7 major questions that are very, I would say, high-level questions that actually lead to more questions in some instances. But the teams are working on drafting a 3-chapter report right now that will go back to the governor. You have a copy of the background that the chairs of the GISI were kind enough to allow me to share with you. There will be some updates to that as we move forward. But right now, the teams are working on Chapter 3 and kind of specific areas within there to flesh out more detail. And as the report progresses, it becomes more and more detailed. So the teams are doing a massive amount of work writing in Chapter 3 right now, and then that will come back to editorial team and then eventually to the governor. Our timeframes have shifted a little bit. We are hoping for late June, early July timeframe to have everything out and complete. And I know it's a very broad topic, so I would pause there, I guess, and just tell you that any questions that you might have, I'll try to answer. But I don't want to drag you through all 4 of those documents if we don't need to.
Okay, any questions, committee, at the outset? Okay, well, I guess I have one then. I guess in this committee, we're going to be focused on whatever policy recommendations come out of this initiative. Of course, that which would require legislation. Any insight into that and how that discussion is going?
Mr. Chairman, I think the teams, there's multiple layers within that policy discussion, as you're well aware. There's not only local policy or stuff at a regional level within the state of Wyoming, but then state level legislation, what's in our statutes right now, and then in regional perspectives, especially since we have so many federal partners in Wyoming. You have Department of Interior and Department of Ag and the agencies that are nested within them. Some of the issues that the teams have identified possibly could be solved with some legislation at the state level. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like yet. I think the teams are more focused on identifying some of the issues, potentially providing some recommendations that would be, finite enough that you could craft legislation based on them. But the teams are part of the challenge for the teams themselves is the makeup, just because we have so many different partners and they are limited in some of their ability to, say, provide a funding recommendation if they're strictly a research entity. And so we're trying to navigate some of that, and definitely don't want to provide a document that is just this would be nice, everybody get along type thing. We want some actual recommendations to come out of it. So we're trying to thread that needle a little bit right now.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And obviously, the specific policy proposals are always great. That makes our job easy, but it's not a requirement. If there's an issue that you think we can help with, that it's also part of our jobs is to identify problems and use our knowledge base to go about fixing them through statute or through funding. And so that's, I guess, the last question I had planned to ask you is, obviously we more than quadrupled the amount of the state grant last session. And so I was wondering if there's been any discussion as to how that might change things with the way that grant works, how you see that working within the overall context of invasive species management in the state.
Mr. Chairman, that one I think would be a great question for the weed and pest. I can give you a little insight onto some of the funding discussions we've had if you'd like that. But really the funding portion for these teams has, again, going back with such a diverse mix of folks, we've got everything from private industry and landowners to federal agencies. And so really trying to kind of figure out how, say, a BLM office goes about funding, or the Forest Service goes about funding compared to the weed and pest district or an individual producer. And a lot of that surrounds timeframes and end of year for different groups. So if you're a federal agency, you don't necessarily get to have a savings account. Whereas, you're the way that some of those budgets are structured, you have a year or 2 years to use something. And similar could be said for a lot of the research and the way that funding is passed to research. Whereas if you're a private landowner, you might say, I'm going to allocate X amount of dollars over a 10-year period to combat leafy spurge or something like that. So the funding discussion has been largely around kind of the process, and we can get a rough estimate on how much we've spent. I don't think anybody could give you a realistic number on what it would take to, say, get rid of or contain cheatgrass or something like that, because the numbers they're just going to fluctuate so much, and they'd be astronomical, I think. So the funding is more, that discussion is more of a, how do we leverage dollars? How do we put them on the ground in a way that makes sense? And what are the timeframes that we're really talking about to get some actual management on the ground?
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for the Governor's Office Committee? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, thanks, Joe. Maybe stick around if you can, and appreciate the update and look forward to the full report in August.
Thanks.
Okay, next up we have Slade Franklin with he's a weed and pest coordinator for the Department of Agriculture. and Doug Miyamoto. Welcome back, Doug. Good to see you, Slade. We'll wait for Doug's audio to get connected, and once that happens, either one of you, whoever wants to take the lead, go ahead and present the information you have for us.
Am I coming through okay? All right.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about weed and pest program again this year. I did turn in some documents for you based on what I'm going to talk about today. Just talking to both the chairmans, we thought we'd talk a little bit about how we're going to move forward with the administration of the grant funding as emphasis, but certainly we'll be willing to answer any questions you might have about weed and pests in general. It was a great question, Mr. Chairman, you had to Joe about what the Governor's Invasive Species Initiative impacts will be with that grant funding, or how that grant funding will help. And it is certainly something that we are going to look very closely at what the final product is from the Governor's office as we're moving forward with the funding, to ensure that we're maybe meeting some of those funding priorities that are identified in that final report. So I'll bring up a few places in my testimony where I talk about that, but certainly, like I say, we'll answer any questions as we go. So again, Slade Franklin, Weed Pest Coordinator for Wyoming Department of Agriculture. And just the quick synopsis of House Bill 36 from this past session. It does take effect July 1st of this year. We do anticipate that the funds, we cannot, I guess I should put it, we cannot spend those funds until we have collected them first. So it is a dollar in, dollar out account, similar to what it was before the bill was passed. And most of the registrations were collected before July 1st. So I'm still a little unsure on what the actual funding availability will be going into spring 2021. Those are some of the details that we're trying to work out here these coming months. But we do certainly expect full utilization of the funds by 2022. Again, that's just kind of some of the questions we got to figure out in terms of what's available in 21 and what's available in 22. So it does quadruple the funding, grant funding that we had available in the past. So we expect somewhere around 1.4 million annually that'll be available for invasive species or weed and pest grant programs. How that program is administered, we do have in statute a committee that is that oversees that funding and allocates those funds. It's under 11.5.113. The committee is separate from the Weed and Pest Council, so it's not a council committee. It's a standalone committee, and that committee is made up of the Department of Ag Director, a member of the Board of Ag, 3 members from the Weed and Pest Council, and right now 2 of those are supervisors from districts, and 1 is a landowner from Weston County. So a good input from, I think, all perspectives when it comes to ag and from weed and pest, and they do a fairly thorough job when it comes to going through those grants. So 2 of those members are on public comments today, so you may have an opportunity to quiz them a little bit about their individual processes with that committee if need be. When it comes to authorities and responsibilities, those are also defined under that same statute, and the board, speaking of that committee, will allocate any funds from the legislative appropriations pursuant to a formula they adopt as a committee. There is a statute in there that talks about no district board shall receive an amount of excess of 1/3 of its actual expenditures. Really, that statute comes back from the day when weed pest districts and private landowners could have their weeds controlled, and then the landowner would pay 1/3 of the costs. The weed and pest district would pay 1/3 of the cost, and the state would pay 1/3 of the cost. So although that statute is still in there, we don't typically refer to that one very closely, and probably doesn't serve much value in terms of the process we use today. There also, if a board determines a weed pest is seriously endangered areas of district or state, assistance may be provided by appropriation for this purpose, and the allocations committee shall allocate the appropriation accordingly. To some degree, that statute does give us what we call early detection rapid responsibilities. So if we do see new invasives, obviously we talked about Medusa head bent knot last year, but there are a lot of different invasives out there in states surrounding us, and that really does give us an opportunity to use some of those state fundings to attack it very quickly. Now, the allocations committee does have, like I say, a standalone, so they are responsible for ensuring the funds are properly expended. That's also a portion of my job as I work with those districts to make sure that we're focusing on what state priorities we have at the state list, or just simply answering questions on how the funds can or cannot be used within their programs. And really, they just submit a voucher and documentation as needed, either when they're requesting the funding, or we do require a final report when they are done with their programs and pay accordingly. Statute also does allow a city or town to get funding through this program. They do have to petition for funding through a district board. So our expectation is if a city or town wanted some funding from the grants, that they would be working with their district board to submit that request. At least as long as I've been in this position, I haven't had any city or towns that have done that specifically. So just quickly how the State Allocations Committee works. We do have a grant application. I believe I attached that for you guys to look at. We send that out in the early March or early February, excuse me, establish a deadline where those grants are required to be turned in. This year it was March 3rd. And then we have a meeting of the SAC where we meet and we do the allocation of all funds. And when they allocate funds, they're not only allocating grant funds, they're also allocating the YDOT right-of-way weed control funds, and also some federal funds that we get through the Forest Service. So we utilize that committee for any funds that we have come in for the state, just because there is it's a good working committee and they have good perspective in terms of what's the best way to use those funds, and its programs have been thoroughly thought out. And then, like I say, the WDA handles all the contracting and payments, but the final reports, which are typically due December 31st or March 15th, are reviewed by the WDA, and they're also reviewed by the State Allocations Committee in the spring when they meet. So the reason why some of the final reports are due March 15th is just timing of applications. We do have grant applications that do help with prairie dogs, which not an invasive species, it is a native, but we do assist with some of those programs, and typically those programs happen in the fall to early spring. So March 15th allows them to do all their control programs in the time frame where the pesticides allow. We also have some salt cedar Russian olive programs, and even some Dalmatian toadflax programs that do applications in the winter when the ground's frozen, and had pretty good results. So weed control doesn't always happen just in the summer and the spring. So we try to accommodate them with the grant program. So what we have done in the past is we have prioritized grant funding for those districts that out of the 23 districts that are utilizing their full local mill levies. There are 2 mill levies available for each district, and we do try to accommodate those ones that are maxing out those 2 mills and still have some needs for programs. We take leafy spurge as a priority in the past, and that is also because of the special management program statutes, where leafy spurge is prioritized. So we always look at leafy spurge a little higher than some of the others. And then again, we also do have special management programs for prairie dogs and other species too. And then there are a couple non-spray programs that we have utilized grant funds for. We mentioned last year, there is a statewide mapping effort that we work with all the districts to ensure we're all mapping invasives the same way statewide, so we can do data sharing a little better. And then we also try to help with biocontrol and the research into new biocontrol tools to control some of these invasive species. With that, I just kind of gave a quick breakdown of how grant funds have been utilized the last 4 years from the districts. One of the things that we do not allow, and you're gonna have to bear with me. I put this together before our first date when we were expected to meet, and I had points in my head I wanted to bring out with each of these topics, and in the last 2 weeks I've kind of forgotten what some of them were, but we do not allow with our grant applications to the applicants to pay for full-time salaries. You'll see $55,000 in there for full-time salaries. And there was a specific grant that we did have that we made an exception for with full-time salaries, and I just can't remember which one that was. But typically with our grants, we don't allow full-time salaries to be paid out of the grant funds. You'll also see supplies and materials are highlighted blue. That is because some of the applicants sometimes put the pesticides that they purchase under supplies, and some of them put it under materials. So actually you could combine those two to see that what has been spent with grant funds for pesticides over the last 4 years for the programs. And then you can also see, which is a significant number, contractual services, over $1 million. So we are actually contracting out this work, whether it's aerial applicators. We have some private businesses that do work with ATVs, and some of those districts will contract with those private businesses to get the work done. And then lastly, you may notice on here is the administration is at $700. That's another thing the committee has really put a thumb down on, is allowing grant funds to be used for administration. They feel that all the boards are well funded locally to pay for those administrative costs, and the intent of the grant funds should be putting those funds on the ground to control weeds. So that's where the priority is with the grant funding, is to make sure we get weeds controlled or prairie dogs controlled as needed. So just a little synopsis of how we've done that over the last 4 years. And I should note that this is all the grant funds except YDOT YDOT funds are not included in that breakdown. So we can talk about that a little more if you guys have questions when I'm done here, and hopefully clarify some points. So moving forward with the new funding available coming into the next year, a little bit of the plan that we have as the SAC committee and the Department of Ag.
Just a second, Slade, looks like our Senator Moniz has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Slade, I've got a question and a comment. First question is, why do you need 7 copies of an application?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, the reason I do that is because I'm lazy. Since I have a committee and I have administration, I ask them to submit those 7 copies so I can easily put it in a notebook, send it out to the committee 2 weeks before we meet, and then they can review it. So it's to simplify the process for me to make sure everyone's getting a copy so they have time to review it.
So then if I could make a suggestion, Slade, why don't you make it a fillable PDF form, and you wouldn't have to send any paper out. They could fill it out and email it to everybody.
Right. Mr. Chairman, we actually have had some grants, especially this last year with the COVID, that we have utilized the PDF format. And it's certainly something that, maybe we can utilize a little better in the future. We have had problems in the past with some of the committee members didn't have internet or computer access. And so that was a little more of a concern, but at least right now this committee all does. So that would certainly be something I can look at doing to simplify the paper load.
Okay, more questions, committee, before Slade moves on. Covered a lot of ground already, so any questions right now? Okay, well, I have a few if nobody else does. First of all, we talked about prioritizing the grants going to districts with full mill levies. Slade, do you have any hard numbers as to what percentage of funds goes to districts with their full mill levy as opposed to funds that go to districts without the full mill levy?
Mr. Chairman, of the 4 years that are shown here, all but 1 grant have gone to districts at their full 2 mills. The only grant that has not gone to a district at their full 2 mills is the GIS mapping grant. And that grant has gone to Fremont County, who has helped the whole state with the mapping process. They have people on staff that have been able to help all the districts with the mapping. So that is the only grant that I'm aware of that has not gone to a full 2 mill county.
And also, you see the good categories there of different, and only $700 of grants have gone to administrative costs. I was wondering how you define administrative costs. Say if somebody goes out and buys a new pickup truck, does that count as administrative, or is that if they're using it to go out and do work, but it's obviously not actually impacting directly, putting pesticides or herbicides on the ground? How does that work?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, typically what I define, and I'd have to look back at that $700. I think it was 1 grant or 2 grants in the past that did that. But purchasing of a truck would be equipment in my book for the way we have this grant set up. So we have an equipment section there. So that would be where they would put a purchase such as a truck. So typically it's those indirect expenses associated with the program, you know, building costs, copiers, a lot of that indirect costs that are associated with running an office that I consider administrative costs.
And a follow up to that, it looks like a lot of our those funds are on contractual services. Is there any attempt to define once you lease that contract, whether the contractor is putting those funds on the ground, and if there's any attempt to sort of categorize those, the way those contractual fees are being used, whether they're going to buying a new pickup truck every year, or whether they're actually going to putting stuff on the ground?
Mr. Chairman, I'd have to look at some of those invoices to be sure, but most of the time what you'll see is, for instance, aerial application. They'll send an invoice and say, you know, 1,000, 2,000 acres sprayed at a certain cost, and that is laid out in terms of the total cost for that invoice. So my interpretation of those is that it's all on the ground, but I'd really have to take a close look at that to tell you the right answer or the confident answer.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Anybody else have any questions at this point? Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see on your slate, excuse me, I see on your past funding priorities, you had 10 counties there that maximize their full mill levy. How many counties are at their full mill levy is probably my question to you. And are these the hardest hit counties, or have they maximized their mill levies? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, there is, I believe, 11 of the 23 that are utilizing their full 2 mill levies. We do have one that is not listed here, Fremont County, that it has been utilizing a portion of their second mill, not their full second mill. With that, obviously, when we talk about Medusa Head and Ventonada, Sheridan County is the county that comes up the most, and you can see they're one of the counties at their full 2 mill. When you talk about, for instance, prairie dogs, which is usually the control programs are on the eastern side of the state, you will see Platte County, Goshen County, and Weston County are on there, although I'm not sure Weston gets one for prairie dogs anymore. So I would say that it's definitely there's other issues in the counties that aren't at their full 2 mills. You know, you can look at some of the cheatgrass problems that Teton County is fighting, and they're not at their full 2 mill, or Park County for that matter with the Shoshone National Forest. So I wouldn't say that these counties have all the problems in the state, but they certainly have their own specific problems they're dealing with.
Okay, thank you, Representative Blake. Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Slade. I'm still on that past funding priorities spreadsheet there. I want to make sure I understand that clearly. So the $2 million at the total of that spreadsheet is a total of 4 years. So I divide that by 4 if I'm looking at an annual. So we're roughly at about 500,000 per year. I divide that by the 10 counties above that you've listed. So that's roughly $50,000 per county. Is that per year, per county? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, the amount that goes to those counties varies based upon their grant application. So for instance, Washakie County has they've only do one grant application annually. And that one is specifically for $50,000, at least last 4 years, 50,000. Niobrara County turns in 4 different grant applications, and if you add up their amount, it may be more around the 70, 80,000. So it varies based on their requests, and like I say, they do have to put in a request in a budget and how they're going to spend that. So we just don't divide it evenly amongst all of them.
Okay, go ahead, Slade. Any further questions, I guess, before we move on? Okay, all right, go ahead, Mr. Franklin.
All right, Mr. Chairman, just kind of what we're looking at doing to accommodate both the new funding and the Governor's Invasive Species Initiative. We are planning to have a state allocations committee this summer where we sit down and discuss both the final report from the governor's office or governor's team and the funding itself. We had some initial conversations at our state allocations committee in March. However, we do feel that we need to take a very close look at that grant application form that I gave you and see how we can expand on that or improve that, especially with the mindset of, I think what's going to come out of the Governor's Invasive Species Initiative, or one of the major points, is that need for landscape scale control, and how the state and this grant program can be one of the leading funding sources to help accommodate that. And that's may need to reaccommodate or reevaluate how that form is developed, rediscuss or relook at how we lay partners out in the form and what have you. So there could be a lot of changes that we look at incorporating into the process, just to ensure that we are accountable both as a committee, as a department, and as a state, in making these funds most thoroughly utilized as needed. Then I just put a little additional information on there, talking about administration costs or indirect costs. We do believe, I think, as a department and as a Weed Pest Council, when it comes to grant funding, majority of the grant funding, or if not all the grant funding, should be put on the ground for the management. So, we do minimize our federal funding indirect costs. We minimize indirect costs from YDOT to ensure that the right-of-way funding is going on the ground. And we do that with any of these, any special grant funding that may come in that is not associated with those two programs. And then just as another a comparison, the other grant program I run is the Emergency Insect Management Grant, which utilizes state funds for, right now, for grasshoppers and mosquitoes. There are statutes in there that restricts the programs from utilizing those grant funds for indirect costs of first 3 years. They can only utilize their grant funds for 20% of the administrative costs. In any year after that, only 10%. So we do have another program that does set statutory standards on what can be charged for indirect costs. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions you have about the process for the allocation of funds or weed and pest as a whole, or for that matter, my part in the Governor's Invasive Species Initiative.
Okay, questions, committee? Any further questions for Mr. Franklin? Okay, well, since you mentioned it, I guess I'll ask, what was your perspective of what we might expect from, in terms of policy recommendations from the Invasive Species Task Force?
Mr. Chairman, it's a great question. As you know, they have separated us all out into subcommittees at this point. We're working on our individual sections of the document. I have been assigned the gaps and challenges section, and you were probably on that email I sent out Friday that kind of gave a list of some of the things that we're looking at. But I do believe one of the things that, as I mentioned before, is really going to come out is how do we remove jurisdictional boundaries and we start looking at things from a landscape scale, especially on these new invasives, whether it's Medusa head bent nata, yellow star thistle, something that hasn't come in yet or possibly could come in. So those are going to be some of the policy gaps I see. I'm not 100% sure how we deal with those through statutes, and there may be some solutions to that, but that's kind of been the key point I've heard of most from the participants, is that landscape scale, removing jurisdictional boundaries. There are a few things that our policy gaps and challenges team are going to talk about when it comes to state policies, and we're meeting again this afternoon. We're going to discuss whether or not there's any need for a statewide policy on the movement of hay. We do have 3 quarantines in the state that help mitigate the movement of non-certified hay or require it to be covered. Is there a value in doing that statewide? We're going to talk about how we can funding for state funding sources having restrictions, and how we can, overcome some of those restrictions, whether it's state lands, whether it's, state parks. If we're looking at landscape scale, again, that whole jurisdictional boundary thing. And then working with the leasees, making sure that they are, either aware of what funding may be available to help them, or what programs that are out there that they need to be participating in, whether it's a federal leasee or state leasee. So yeah, there's a few out there that we're going to look at from a state policy perspective. I can't say anything will come from them, but they are at least a starting point for our discussions in the policies or the challenges and gaps subcommittee.
Hey, Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Slade, you said looking at the possibility of covering non-certified hay. Have we got a problem in the state scattering on seeds, or why are we looking at that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this goes back to the discussions we talked a little bit last year about transportation corridors. Fundamentally, one of the biggest issues we have with invasive species in the introduction is going to be along those right-of-ways of highways and interstates. And a great example was, I think it was somewhere 2010, when I think Texas had the big drought. There was a lot of hay that was moved along the interstate from North Dakota, even through Wyoming down to Texas. And I just happened to go to North Dakota that year and see some of the hay that they were harvesting. And I wouldn't call it good hay, put it that way. I mean, they were harvesting everything they could with it because they're going to make a pretty significant, sell down in Texas, and they're moving it through Wyoming. So I'm not saying, Senator Moniz, that this is a solution. It is just something worth talking about, because I do believe that is a vector for the introductions along those interstates and highways, and hay movement does add to that.
Go ahead, Senator Moniz.
So I guess back to my original question, have you got evidence it's a problem? Have you noticed a problem along the interstates or highways?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, we have a continuous problem of managing invasive species along those interstates and highways. I will say we have one of the better programs in the West in terms of managing those invasives, but there is a continuous issue with invasive species along the highways, and especially on some of our areas next to bordering states. From my perspective, you look on heading south from Wyoming, and the white top issue and thistle issue that is along the interstate from Colorado. There are some significant issues along those right-of-ways.
Okay, any further questions for Slade? Okay, we also, Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Slade, I just wondered what's the grasshopper infestation is going to look like this year, if you have any idea.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's going to be a problem. We've already had calls in some various areas in the state where hatches are occurring. We're seeing some significant numbers up in the northern part of the state. And you couple that with, at least in a lot of the places in the state, we haven't had a lot of spring moisture, and we're already seeing some areas browning up where we might not have vegetation for both the grasshopper and the wildlife and agriculture. So I am a little bit concerned about the early indications of grasshoppers, and I think we're going to see some pretty significant hotspots across the state.
Thank you.
And so a follow-up based off that, how do our districts deal with that? Is there, how much flexibility do they have? Are they fairly responsive? Just if you could spend a little bit of time talking about how we respond to those indications, that'd be great.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, did I understand the right in terms of how the districts are preparing for grasshoppers?
Yeah, if just kind of step through the procedures. I mean, just relying on people calling in and saying, I saw some hatching going on, and then they respond, or they have their own ability to assess where these pests will be coming from. How does it work?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, what we rely on heavily is the USDA APHIS does a fall survey for adult grasshoppers in the state. And they go around various locations throughout, and they identify areas where there are significant numbers at the end of the summer of grasshoppers, which indicates there may be a heavy hatch going into the next year. So based on USDA's survey last year, we were aware that there was going to be some problems coming into this summer. So we, whether it was at the Weed and Pest Council meeting or other opportunities, the Wyoming Pesticide Applicators Association meeting, we have APHIS involved to talk about where those significant issues could be. Based on that, most of the districts had landowner meetings in early February where they published and announced that this could be a problem. If you'd like to participate in a treatment program, please come in our office, and we'll have a landowner meeting, talk about what we'll do to control them. And then based on the landowners that sign up early, they create treatment blocks. With grasshoppers, it's very similar to that, what we talked about with weeds. Landscape scale does the most good. So they try to create as big as blocks as possible. And then what they wait for basically is, then they also utilize the state's emergency insect management grant, which we funded most of those programs to help assist with their programs. And then they wait until they see the hatch. And when the hatch starts, then they utilize what's called the reduced agent rats, where they spray strips using Dimilin. Dimilin is a stops the molting of the grasshopper. So it's actually a fairly safe product for other insects out there. And it treats them early before they become a problem. So we try to be very proactive with it. We have a lot of districts that are initiating spraying this week. I think one of the, Rod Litzel, who is from Johnson County, is on public comment. I believe he told me that they're starting today maybe with their treatments. So we try to be proactive, try to get it all organized early, but there's always spots that we don't anticipate that come out too.
Thank you, appreciate it. Any further questions for Mr. Franklin? Okay, seeing none, we also have Director Miyamoto on the line. Not sure if he wants to add anything.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I don't have anything to add unless anybody has any questions, from the allocations committee perspective or something like that. At the Department of Ag, I was looking through the records earlier this morning to get a handle on the question around administrative expenses. We as a department don't take any money from the pesticide registration fee program at all. We just pass it on through, make sure, it gets on the ground the best that we can. So we don't have any, we as a department don't have any expenses for that program. So as Slade mentioned, we met as a committee earlier this year, and it's been a pretty good program. I have enjoyed watching the districts kind of collaborate on this program. I have worked on a lot of allocation committees. I've never seen a group of county districts come together and be as accepting of each other. They're all in the room usually, and they give their presentation about what their projects entail. And when that conversation is over, you get a lot of districts that say, you know what, we could probably do with a little less in this area if our neighbors are willing to spray a little past their line and into our county. And it's a trading deal that seems to work fairly well. I've not seen anything like that in any other sector. So that program seems to be very effective for us. But if anybody has any questions about the department's role in the program, I'm happy to answer those.
Okay, any questions, committee? Okay, thank you, Director. I appreciate it. Okay, so we do have somebody from the Department of Audit to answer any questions or give some information and answer questions about how they determine what falls into which category, from what I understand. So Mr. Richard Cummings is up next. So looking forward to whatever information he has to present to the committee. Mr. Cummings, can you hear me? Mr. Cummings, can you hear me? Mr. Cummings, we cannot hear you. I'm not getting any audio. Can anybody else hear Mr. Cummings? Yeah, Mr. Cummings, you're still got no audio for you. Yeah, Kayla, you want to say something?
I was just going to say maybe it might help to take the headphones out of the computer completely and just have the computer pick up the audio. Sometimes headphones with speakers seem to cause issues.
Okay, did you hear that, Mr. Cummings? Nod your head if you heard that, maybe. Okay, and you are muted, so okay, there we go. Maybe try again. Yeah, we still got nothing.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Got you loud and clear.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I was listening to you guys on the broadcast, and that might have created some issues. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having us, for having me again. And my understanding is you're all wanting me to kind of go over the budget process. Is that correct?
Yes, just trying to get some insight on the, especially as it deals with these weed and pest grants, just what the process is and what role the Department of Audit plays in that process.
Okay. So basically, Mr. Chairman, all we do, as far as the budgeting process works, it's the same for all special districts. It's as you guys know, it's the master financial plan. It basically it's their expected costs for the upcoming fiscal year, along with the expected means of how they're going to finance it or fund for it. So that's really what it lays out to. So when they go through the budgeting process, it's basically a 3-phase process. There's a preparation phase, an adoption phase, and an execution phase. During the preparation phase, for most special districts, this usually will happen, or we suggest that the preparation phase occur approximately around May 1st, because they're required to submit a proposed budget to the Department of Audit and the county clerk by June 1st. So with that, when they're during the preparation phase, they're looking at 3 years. They're looking at last year's fiscal year. They're looking at the current fiscal year, and then obviously they're looking at their upcoming proposed year that they're going to budget. And that's kind of how they lay it out. We have a form that they're required to follow, and it lays it out in that fashion. So we look at it that way, and then once they lay that out, then they go into what's called the adoption phase. The adoption phase has three parts to it. There's the optional part of a pre-hearing that the county commissioners can hold. The county commissioners can request that special districts present to them prior to their own hearing, prior to their own special district hearing. And so during that hearing, they look at the district is expected to submit their proposed budget, verifications of elections, public meetings, and if they're not required to have any board member trainings, but if they have any, any verification of those, and then as well as meeting minutes. Those are the expected items to be presented during a pre-hearing process if the county commissioners so choose to have one. Now, that's not required, but what is required to happen in the adoption phase is the special district is required to have a hearing, a public hearing. So what they need to do is about 1 week, at least 1 week prior to their hearing, they need to publish it, either in a local paper if they have one, or in 3 conspicuous locations so that people know that it's going to happen. And then that hearing notice needs to be sent to the Department of Audit. So when they hold the hearing, they have to hold the hearing no later than the 3rd Thursday in July. And then after that hearing is held, they have to adopt the budget within 3 business days. And again, once that is adopted, they have to submit that adopted budget to the county commissioners no later than July 31st. They also have to submit that final budget to the Department of Audit as well as the county clerk. So then once adoption happens, basically then you're in the 3rd phase, which is execution. So what is execution? Execution is basically just spending the authorized money that has been laid out in the budget. We always suggest to special districts that they keep their books in the same categories as the way they laid out their budget. It helps them to manage their budget and spend within their budget properly and everything. However, there are times that a district will receive more funds and then have that ability to spend more than what they had originally budgeted to spend. If that occurs, prior to them spending that money, they have to amend their budget. So they have to basically go through the hearing process again and amend the budget to allocate the additional funds that they would have to spend. Again, the basis behind that is that no special district, no governing body can spend more than what they've budgeted. So with that being said, they have to amend the budget in that aspect. So that's basically the budgeting process, very simple, very down and dirty, really. There's obviously nuances with it, and then the details of the budget is really dependent upon the entity on how detailed they want to make their budget. So with that, I'll stand for questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cummings. Appreciate it. Any questions, committee? Okay, I'll have one just so you don't get off quite so easily, Mr. Cummings. But in terms of the level of detail, is there any attempt by the Department of Audit to go through and verify that those funds are used in the way that they say there are? What was the audit function with these special districts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the way the audit function works in the aspect is these budgets will come in and we'll have copies of those. But again, those amended budgets may occur throughout the year and everything. And that's fine. We ask that they send those to us, but sometimes there's no statutory requirement. However, what the statutory requirement is that at the end of every fiscal year, by September 30th, all government entities are required to submit a census report to us, in which case it lays out what their actual expenditures and what their actual revenues were for that year and how much cash they have left and any debt. And so what we do is we go out and we'll conduct an audit. So if an entity gets selected based on certain key factors, if an entity gets selected for an audit, what we will do is one of the processes that we look at is we compare what they actually spent in those on that census report with their budget and kind of discuss with them, you know, how, if they went over, if they didn't go over. And then also when they submit those census reports to us, that is one of the items that we look at as well in detail, is if they had exceeded their budgets that we had on file in relation to what they actually spent. And if they do, if it appears that it looked like it went over, what we usually do is we will contact the entity to see, one, first, did you amend a budget? Can we see a copy of that and make sure that they didn't exceed the expenditures, the budgeted expenditures, that is.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Committee, any more questions for the Department of Audit? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Cummings. It's good to, I know it was kind of surprising to me to learn that there's another state agency involved. So we appreciate hearing from you from an agency that maybe doesn't normally testify on the Joint Ag Committee. It's a very informative presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, next up we have Keith Kennedy with the Wyoming Agribusiness Association. Mr. Kennedy, as soon as you're ready, looks like you are connecting to audio right now. Feel free to go ahead and continue with your testimony as you have a chance.
Not until I unmute myself. There we go. Keith Kennedy with the Wyoming Ag Business Association. I'm one of the 13 members of the advisory committee for the Pesticide Safety Education Program. And we wanted to at least give you a brief update on that, where that's been since it's been in place 5 years now. And some history for those that might not know, up until 2015, pesticide safety education was funded by EPA grants, which had gradually declined and then been eliminated that year. And that was when we funded this through $15 charge on pesticide registration fees. Since that time, EPA has changed two things substantially with pesticide safety. First of all, the worker protection standard was completely rewritten, much different than it was earlier. And the second thing is the certification and training standards. Those have also changed, and each state is required to submit a plan. We've received preliminary indication that Wyoming's plan is acceptable to Region 8, but there will be some substantial changes. The one that will be most noticeable for the nearly 4,600 private applicators, our indication right now is that they will need to recertify every 3 years rather than the current 5 years. In the past, most of these private applicators have renewed their license by attending an event that Extension would hold in every county. For commercial applicators, those for hire, of which there are nearly 1,800 through the state, they have traditionally done this through continuing education units, both from outside entities and then in conjunction with Wyoming Ag Business, the Wyoming Weed Management Association. We have an annual training which suffices for that once every 3 years. However, many folks attend that every year. COVID-19 has made presented some difficulties for these licenses. especially the University of Wyoming's policy on cancellation of all in-person educational meetings, as well as all in-person testing at county extension offices. Right now, those travel restrictions for university personnel are in place until the end of July. Fortunately, EPA Region 8 approved Wyoming Department of Ag and Extension in issuing temporary licenses, and because Wyoming has a take-home workbook, which had been one way that private applicators had recertified in the past. Those temporary licenses are only good through the end of this coming January 2021. And you'll have to take an exam then to renew that license. The Pesticide Safety Education Program, the advisory committee consists of 13 members, as I mentioned earlier, and that comes from a cross-section of folks that are interested and involved. There's someone from a supervisor from a weed and pest district, as well as an aerial applicator, commercial ag applicator. Based on my background, I'm also helping with, I was involved, had an industrial spraying business for about 10 years, did right-of-way and industrial sites, as well as folks from Extension and from the Safety Education Program. There are some difficulties coming up that we'll have to deal with. Part of the process with the update to the certification and training is all of these categories have to be updated and somewhat standardized to the extent possible. We're using folks from materials that are developed elsewhere, but we're necessary editing to suit Wyoming for specific needs. The two categories that'll get finished this year are Aquatic Weed Control Manual and another one for Sewer Rip Control Manual. And those are specific. There are actually 32 separate categories. Those won't decrease when the new standards go into effect when they're approved by EPA. There are also online training modules that are available free for folks to use. One is on prairie dog management. There's a total of 20 hours that are continuing education units available, and there are also ones that are available at cost from others. I wanted to briefly mention the Department of Ag, along with Slade, had surveyed weed and pest districts to find out what some of the issues were. About 7 years ago, when personnel changed in this program, up until then, we had someone full-time with some help, and there was some very specific training given for weed and pest districts, some weed ID and issues like that. With the changes in what's required for worker protection standard, as well as certification and training, the safety education program has tended to concentrate more on that. There are some districts that wish that there was some more specific training, but the other side of that coin is, for many of us in the crop world and the industrial world, we do that training on our own. For example, we, along with Montana, have a certified crop advisor program, which is something that we encourage commercial applicators to use. Helps them with their ability to diagnose specific problems. I think with that, I will leave it to the committee to ask any questions you might have. I did have a couple of points from some of Slade's discussion earlier. Most of these registration fees are paid in January and February, so I would think that the allocations committee would have a pretty good idea of what their available budget would be.
Okay, Mr. Kennedy, before we move on from the pesticide education program, let's just pause there and see if there's any questions, because that is a little bit of a pivot here in the discussion point.
Sure.
So committee, to be clear, we're to be clear, we've kind of shifted the discussion to the pesticide education program that's run through the University Extension for now. And as Mr. Kennedy pointed out, this is something that was instituted from the state's perspective about 5 years ago. I just thought it'd be good to take a look and assess how it's working 5 years in, and just do a little checkup on that program, since we were focused on those pesticide registration fees and continue to be focused on it. So any questions for Mr. Kennedy so far? Representative Larson, I thought I saw something for you. But.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kennedy, you'd mentioned that the federal law was going to make it the registrations were only for 3 years now, and when does that take effect? And also, did UW think about doing a virtual meeting or presentation so people can get their license renewed? That would sure be nice.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, when Wyoming's plan is finally approved by EPA, we believe that private applicators will be on a 3-year cycle. I stand to be corrected. I know that we hoped that we could maintain 5 years, but I have not seen anything in the Federal Register to indicate that EPA would back away from that. As to the second part of your question, that is something that we have discussed with our national groups, because one of EPA's motivators, if you will, during these changes to certification and training standards is presenting a personal ID in person. And while the classes could be done virtually, the test itself, right now, EPA rules do not allow that. We've actually been in touch with our national groups, with CropLife America and RISE, hoping to change that. And I think the experience across the university systems over the last 2.5 months, we actually have a student that's been staying with us here the last 2 months after the dorms closed. He couldn't exactly get back to Singapore. And when he took his finals, he actually had to show his face on camera like we are now, also hold up his ID and verify that those were the same. That's something we've asked EPA to do. It's something in the Certified Crop Advisor program that we instituted about a year ago, where all of the exams are now done online virtually, and your camera has to show a clear desk as well. And we have proctors proctoring remotely. You basically surrender your computer over to the proctor so that you can't do outside research as well. I think those are both valid things to take advantage of the technology we've got. But I think we also need to maintain some way for folks to do that at extension offices or at weed and pest offices for folks that don't have an adequate internet connection for now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions for Mr. Kennedy on the pesticide education program? Okay, I have a few. So I appreciate the historic context with the USDA, or the EPA grants kind of going away. So Mr. Kennedy, before we instituted this this $15 fee, where I understand where the funding came from, but was there a program already at the university that was taking advantage of these federal grants, or is that a new organization that we instituted along with the funding source? What's the history in terms of the entity that provided this training before the EPA took a step back?
before the EPA took this step back, the funding came direct to the Department of Agriculture, and there was an MOU in place. I do not believe, though, that it was fully funded there. That was a position that was funded through extension, and they were on campus in Laramie. And as that amount decreased, the university budget was actually in fairly reasonable shape, and the slack, if you will, was taken up by extension itself when EPA completely eliminated that funding. And we did have some prior warning that would be eliminated. That's when we moved ahead to this current system. It's also when the previous educator retired. He also assisted the range weed scientist on research as well. And so there were some other duties that he had at that time when things were pretty much status quo ante as far as training. Did I answer that question, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you did. And just a follow up to that, how, I guess once we had that $15 fee, that's by my rough math, that's a little less than $200,000 a year going to that specific program. How does that funding compare to the funding that was available before we instituted the fee?
You're asking me to go back a fair ways in my memory. I believe in 2008-9, there was actually maybe even a little bit more than that. I know when we instituted the $15 fee, we felt like it would be more than adequate for quite some period of time, because I don't believe that we fully expended those funds during the first 3 to 4 years, and that there are some funds still held by the Department of Ag that might be available in future years if we have some warning if that won't be adequate to keep the program up, so that we're not coming to you during the middle of a general session asking for that fee increase.
Okay, and that's good to hear. And so just to be clear, there's been an excess of funding, at least in the first 3 or 4 years, and the university, then the extension in particular, doesn't really have an ability to shift those funds around. It has to stay within that program. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct, that those funds are actually held at the Department of Ag. And there is an MOU that is executed every year, and a report that's given to the Department of Ag on how the funds were expended at the end of the year.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions, committee? I guess at this point, before we move on, just to kind of stay on this topic for a little bit, if anybody from the Department of Agriculture has anything to add, Mr. Franklin or Director Miyamoto, now would be a time to say something on the pesticide education program here. So if you have a perspective you'd like to share with the committee right now, as you've been mentioned several times, and it's good to know that the Department of Agriculture is still very much involved in this program, even though it falls under the Extension Service for now. So yeah, any additional testimony from the Department of Agriculture would be useful at this point.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't have anything to add unless there's questions, but that is an account that we house here at the Department of Ag, and we do pass that through to the University of Wyoming for the education component.
And just briefly, what's the status of that account? Is we heard that it maybe that $15 was more than enough. Is it still in pretty healthy shape?
Mr. Chairman, it is.
Okay, Mr. Franklin, you have any more details there?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything I could really add to that. I would add from one perspective just that we do have a district that can talk a little bit about it. the importance of the program on public comment, but it's certainly an important program for the weed and pest districts. I think last year we did a survey of the folks who go through the program or tests, and a third of those are weed and pest, either summer help or summer employees. So it's definitely a critical program for our summer program or summer workers.
Okay, committee, any questions at all on this, on the pesticide education program before we move on? Okay, saying none. Mr. Kennedy, I believe you had some other topics you wanted to cover.
Briefly, I had a couple of comments on some of the testimony earlier regarding the money from the registration fees. Most of those are paid in January and February, and companies tend to pay those in bulk. For example, a company that may have 80 to 90 registrations in the state of Wyoming will pay those in bulk rather than one at a time. I do have some concerns down the road that we will see a decline in the number of registrations, especially on the agriculture and household side, as artificial intelligence becomes more prevalent and companies get a handle on what their actual sales are in a given state. They may decide that it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to maintain a registration of a given product if they don't have commensurate sales. And I realize that's only $140 on a given product, but if there's very little, if any, sales from a company's perspective, it would make little sense to maintain that for only one or two customers or uses during the year. And I'd welcome your comments on that as well. The other one is with the transportation quarters, and that's something that as the Wheat Commission that we've had an issue with for years, where we see untarped trucks going down the road and spreading feral rye along roads where a farmer may have a clean field. And the same is true with cheatgrass, jointed goat grass, as well as some of those winter annuals that are treated as invasives now as well, the Medusa head and Metnata grass. And with that, I welcome any more questions that you might have.
Okay, any further questions for Mr. Kennedy? Okay, saying none, appreciate your testimony, Mr. Kennedy, as always.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And we'll move on to public comment. We got plenty of time here today on the agenda, so even if we don't stick exactly to our 10:30 deadline, I think that's going to be more than okay. This is an important topic that we'll be hearing about significantly moving forward. So next up, we have public comment from some of our weed and pest districts, I believe. Mr. Hale is up. So feel free to provide your comments, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just public comment on the pesticide education safety program. Weed and pest districts, we feel that it's very important.
I'm sorry, sir, could you just state your name for the record and who you're with?
Sorry, Hale Redding with Weston County Weed and Pest. I'm also a member of the Stakeholder Committee for the Pesticide Safety Education Program. But the Weed and Pest Council, we feel that, that program is very important. There's been a few issues in the past, but we're slowly working through those, on getting enough testing sites available. The spring trainings that we were having for our crews, we feel they're very important. We kind of wish that maybe we could get a little more in depth in some of those trainings than what they have here in the past few years, but we're issues that we're working with the extension on to kind of mediate. And other Overall, though, we're very happy with the program. We think that it's some of the training materials getting updated. It takes time and money to do that, and we'd like to see it, go a little faster, but that's just how the university system and extension and government, it all works a little slower than what everybody would like to see. But then, as far as the rest of the testing and the licensing programs with it, we feel that the help is there. They're there to help us as much as they can. However, there's been some lag time in getting our license issued in the past through Department of Ag, but we seem to be getting a little bit better. There's other comments were made in the survey that Slade and Keith mentioned was that once in a while it seems like maybe our crew trainings and landowner trainings may have got hijacked a little bit by the extension service, but we've resolved those issues, I think, for the most part. With that, I'll stand for any other questions from the committee.
Okay, any questions, committee members? Okay, if nobody has one, I'll have one. What's your perspective? It seems like there was a bit of a shift, maybe not a big one, but a small one, kind of towards the extension service and away from the Department of Agriculture. Is there any perspective as to, is one entity easier to deal with than the other between the Department of Agriculture and the UW extension?
I think it kind of depends on the topic, or what your questions is, for each department. And the extension is primarily tasked with the education portion of our licensing. They do all the training, or they're in charge of all the training, all the testing. Department of Ag deals with issuing the licenses. There's the big issue with the testing and training portion is there's only one computer available in each county for testing. It's housed at the extension office. So you have to make an appointment for your summer crews. I mean, in our districts, we range anywhere from 2 or 3 seasonal employees to 20 to 30 seasonal employees. If we're going to try and get them all tested and licensed, that can take 3, 4, 5 weeks to get all of them trained and through the testing process, which is most of your summer is already passed by then. And so an increased testing capacity is the one thing we enjoy about having the trainings through the extension come up and do our mass trainings that we do. They have the ability to bring about 30 laptops with them to do those trainings, and it's nice to be able to try and push them kids through the testing process. Unfortunately, a lot of times the trainings don't go into enough detail. We're limited to about 4 hours of training and 4 hours of testing services. So it's hard to get them kids or your seasonal help to retain the mass amount of information that we're throwing at them in a short amount of time. Then that many tests coming in, and the Department of Ag gets slammed with trying to issue licenses, so there can be a backlog on that. Sometimes we don't get our actual license for our employees until the end of the summer. So it's there's kind of a backlog in there at times. So I hope that answered your question, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as to what Hale just brought up, as far as getting the licensing or not getting it till the end of the summer, is that an issue with seasonal employees as far as college students and so forth? I mean, are there sometimes problems with someone who's only working there for a few months not getting their paperwork back until they're almost ready to leave, or are we talking about more permanent employees?
Mr. Co-Chairman, Chairman, the big hangup is getting it back for our summer employees. A lot of times if they pass the test and everything, it's in the online system. We but we don't always receive actual verification that they passed or that their license has been issued. So we don't have, we get a temporary license if they test online, but we don't always have, you know, the actual license number that we need to put on our documentation. So a lot of times we'll have to call Department of Ag just to get that, so we have the number in our records.
Okay, any further questions, committee? Okay, thank you, Mr. Redding. It's good to see you as always.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Rod Litzel, it looks like. Further comment from our weed and pest districts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Rod Litzel with the Johnson County Weed and Pest. I also sit on the State Allocations Committee. Apologize, I don't have video on my antique computer, but anyway, I was just going to kind of briefly go through our budgeting process. We're kind of follow up on Rich's comments on what we do as a special district. One of the, I guess, main highlights from our standpoint, and to kind of go back in time, where we lived through the ages from being one of the poorest, needing 2 mills, going through the methane boom, and being one of the richest, and now back in the middle somewhere, you know, there when we were doing the methane stuff, we didn't need the 2 mills, and now we're back to doing that, which is back to a budgeting kind of nightmare. Part of the issue for all weed and pest districts is the tail end of the budget is the front end of our spray season. And so when we're doing a budget, we're having to project for what's going to happen the next June, and a lot changes. Slade talked about the grasshoppers, and they do the adult surveys in July and August, and it's hard to project when you're working your budget in June what the grasshoppers are going to be. And so you may end up in a problem if you haven't budgeted for the next June with the grasshoppers, which is what I'm in the middle of right now. I've got over 1.1 million acres signed up to do in grasshoppers this year. And fortunately, my district board has had the foresight in years past where we did have the good funding to put some money away in reserves to handle an outbreak like this. Some other districts aren't quite so fortunate. We've also had the good fortune to be able to work with county commissioners, past and present, that allow us to do that as long as we maintain our transparency within those reserve funds. And so we're able to respond, fortunately, through a budget amendment to handle a grasshopper deal. Not sure how many I can handle, but we can take it on. One of the other things within the budget that from a 2 mill county perspective that's changed in recent years, we obviously have 2 very separate statutes that we work under: the general one, the first mill, and then what was known as the leafy spurge law, which is a totally separate statute and mill assessment. And we would, in the past, excuse me, submit 2 separate budgets to the Department of Audit, the county commissioners. So you had a transparent budget. And it changed here a few years ago where we had to combine those 2 budgets and to submit that to the Department of Audit, where they had been actually doing that for us. They were taking our 2 budgets and putting them together. The issue with that obviously is I still have to turn in a budget to the county that requests our 2 separate mills. There's obviously risks of error when you start adding the 2 together. So when I here in a couple of weeks when I present my budget request to the commissioners, I'm actually presenting 2 different budgets to them so that they know what we're doing with Spurge, they know what we're doing with our other budget, and then I have to turn in a separate budget that goes to the Department of Audit with the 2 of them combined. And so it's an extra process to go through. We're managing it. Only the 2 mill districts are having to do that. I don't know if they are having the same issues. It's just kind of a tracking issue with us. So, and then the only other thing I guess I would say in terms of the budget is, I guess a couple things, the importance of districts being able to build up reserves to be able to handle outbreaks like we're dealing with grasshoppers this year. And then keeping that relationship with the commissioners so that we can do stuff like that. I think it's important in order to keep programs sustained. It's difficult if you don't have sustainability in a program to keep programs going. As funding declines, as we're in the phase right now, it's easier to phase out a program than it is to just chop it off. Landowners expect a certain amount of sustainability in that. With that, I would entertain questions on the budget. I did have one minor comment on the State Allocations Committee, Mr. Chairman, if you'd like to.
Okay, we'll go ahead and pause there, see if there's any questions on the budgeting process from the local district's perspective. Okay, I don't see anything right now, so go ahead and proceed, Mr. Litzel, with your perspective on the SAC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing I would, a couple things, I guess. I appreciate Doug's comments. I think that is a great working committee, and the fact that all the districts do get along and kind of accommodate what the other might be trying to do. And then we as a committee, as Slade mentioned, we're trying to iron out how we're going to handle the extra dollars that are going to be coming in, developing some priorities. At this point in time, we really don't have a set match that we require. The admin was questioned earlier, and I guess that's one thing we allow, so to speak, to, you can put some administrative match, but the committee has been pretty focused on the fact we want to see those dollars on the ground, and the districts obviously want the same goal.
Okay, any questions for Johnson County Weed and Pest? Okay, thank you, Mr. Little. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now we have at least one more participant from our local weed and pest district, so we'll wait as he gets his audio up and running. Okay, Mr. Shorb, you are next. Feel free to introduce yourself to the committee and tell us who you're representing today. Mr. Shorb, you're muted.
How about now?
Can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Sorry for that mistake, Mr. Chairman. My name is Josh Shorb. I'm the supervisor with Park County Weed and Pest Control District up in Powell. And I co-wrote, or I helped write the comments with Rod that we submitted it and that he just went over, and I'm just, I don't really have a whole lot to add. I guess one minor thing is with the increase in the pesticide registration fee this year, Park County is one of the 1 mill counties. And we were previously not eligible to apply for those funds in the past, and we really look forward to being able to access those funds. I'm also a member of the SAC committee, and I think we're going to get together at some point this summer to redo those rules, and it's going to help us in our overall program that we manage up here in in Park County.
Okay, any questions for Park County Weed and Pest? Not at all. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Short. Appreciate you taking the time to testify. It's always good to hear from folks from all over the state here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, committee, that I believe, and LSO staffer wants to jump on and verify. I believe that's all the planned public testimony we had on this topic. Just want to verify that really quick. See a few people waiting in line. I believe most of those are for our next topic. Just want to verify that there's no more public comment before we consider committee actions.
Mr. Chairman, that's all for this topic.
Okay, very good. Appreciate it. Committee, with that, public comment is closed. We heard some testimony as to where they're at with the invasive species task force. We heard about some of the effects that the recent changes the legislature made in terms of the amount and the state grant available to local districts. And we heard about the pesticide education program, which is a joint venture between the Department of Agriculture and the UW Extension. So at this point, certainly entertain any suggestions for bill drafts we might want to consider at our next meeting. Certainly want to make it clear that there isn't we will have this topic, and certainly we'll be engaged in this topic a little bit more heavily as invasive species task force makes its official recommendations to us in August. So, but as of right now, it looks like we're going to have a pretty full agenda on that second meeting. So anything we can get going on right now would also be prudent. So if anybody has any suggestions, any discussion, now's the time for it. Co-Chairman Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, Mr. Chairman, I think we should, at least get some kind of an idea around where we want to go with these, and with I don't know, with everything else on our plate, that we want to try and take another stab at addressing the property rights issue that we brought up in this last session. I do think that deserves to be looked at and tweaked, but until we hear more information back from the task force, I'm not sure. I don't know that we have enough information to start building on something as far as that goes. But I guess if nothing else, I think that we should start with with a directive for LSO staff to start doing some more research into the fee issue, and and possibly along with that, just reach out and see what we can what more we can gather there. So,
Mr. Chairman, when you say the fee directive, you're talking about which fee in particular?
Correct. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Which fee?
The I guess not the fee as it applies to the university and where that funding goes. So.
Okay, so not necessarily a request for a bill draft, but something that would be an agenda item in a little bit more detail at our next meeting, perhaps. Yeah, I agree 100%. That was a fascinating discussion as to the cooperative effort between the university and our Department of Agriculture committee. Is I guess if I was going to make a suggestion, one thing we might want to instituted into statute, it seems to be a current practice, would be the prioritization of the state grants that make sure that they go to efforts on the ground and not so much administrative costs, to make sure that they also continue to go to districts that levy the full 2 mills. I think that's a very good practice and I'm just a little unsure of how that may or may not continue to be a practice if we quadrupled the state grant. So one thing we might want to consider is instituting that practice into statute, and that could be a relatively straightforward bill draft that we could get going today for consideration at our next meeting. Representative Hunt.
Mr. Chairman, I guess, yeah, since you bring that up, I guess I would agree. I think that's something to look into. So if, unless anybody else has other ideas as to how to approach that, I guess I would entertain a motion to go ahead and have LSO start drafting a bill to, see what we can do to address that. So. All right, so I would move that we have LSO. I would move that we'd have LSO begin putting together a bill draft to look at that issue with those counties with those mills. So.
Okay. Heard a motion. Is there a second? Okay, well, I'll second it. Okay, Representative Clausen second. Any discussion, committee? Senator Moniz.
What are we really trying to accomplish here? Is there a need for this, or just a question?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Moniz. I think the idea would be that I think it's a very good practice that they already have instituted prioritizing counties that have their full mill levy, as well as making sure that these funds go to on the ground. And we're just acknowledging the fact that there are more funds available. We want to ensure that they continue to be utilized in such a manner. So just instituting current practices, and the advantage of that would be that it's guaranteed that's going to continue to be the case into the future. So whereas right now there's no guarantee, it's just a practice. So that's the advantage. Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have a big problem with that. I think of a county can be frugal and get by with 1 mill. I think that's a good deal. I have a big issue with requiring that they go to the full rate. The requirement to make sure it goes on the ground for uses, I think that's a good item to have. I really think we should have something in there that if they only do 1 mill, then they should still be eligible. So that's my comment.
Representative Simpson.
I guess I differ a little bit as well. I'm not thinking that we should always be micromanaging state departments' operations. I think that we trust them to do the right thing. If there was some bad policies that came out of departments, then I think we could adjust that and tweak in the statute. But I think we have a good policy, a good department, everything's working successfully. I think we leave it alone. I'm a no on this motion.
Okay, Representative Tass.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. I don't think we need to write more laws to try to address something that is working the way it is presently. I think we should leave it alone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Representative Blake, did I see your hand up? Or?
Yeah, I just want to echo the past 2 speakers. I think it's working well. I don't think we need to get in there and change anything at this time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion on the motion? Okay, going once, going twice.
Question.
Seeing none. Oh, Representative Winter, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address Representative Hunt's proposal there. And could you get some clarification on your thinking there, Representative Hunt?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I guess you know, I would agree with the good, with Representative Larson that, you know, we would hope and expect that the county be frugal, but I guess if we want to at least, if what we wanted to do is put this bill together to give them the opportunity to have that second mill, I don't know, without direct interference at the state level. I mean, if they feel that there's a need to do that, then to give them that power to, you know, that opportunity to do that. So I think it's an issue of local control. If they want to enact it, they can. They don't need to. So, you know, no harm, no foul. So I guess that's the reasoning behind that. Thank you.
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, if I didn't hear the motion correctly, let me know, but I thought the motion was to say that grants would not go to counties that do not assess the 2 mills.
I believe the motion was that they'd be prioritized for those who do have the 2 mills. Not necessarily a hard and fast no, but the key would be prioritized in keeping with current practice. And of course, the idea being that, you know, if a county isn't going to assess the full 2 mills, why are they going to the state for funding when they should be disposing of the resources available to them? So anyways, Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yeah, that thank you for articulating that better than I did. I've been juggling a couple different things over here, but anyway, that was my intention, and that was the intent that I was putting forward. So thank you.
Representative Tass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Isn't that the policy that is being the process that's being used today? And if it is, why do we need to put it in statute? I think that's what I understand them to say earlier, that that's the way it was being handled anyway.
Okay, and yeah, absolutely. We, as I said numerous times before, this is just basically solidifying the current practice and statute, recognizing the significant change that is about to happen with his state grant quadrupling. So that's all that we're doing, is in the best practice and instituting into law, recognizing the change that's about to happen here over the next year or so. So yep, that's to answer that question. That's it. No more, no less. Not a terrible difficult concept, but I think it's important that we understand the reasoning behind it. Representative Larson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you again. I guess I just still have a big issue with this. I'm going to be a no vote. Park County has a lot of federal ground and they don't get taxed. So I have a big issue with it.
Okay, I think your objection is duly noted at this point, Representative Larson. Thank you. Okay, any further questions? Okay, if not, we'll go ahead and just do a show of hands. All in favor of the motion, go ahead and raise your hand and keep them raised until we have a good count. Okay, that's a quick one. We've got 3 in favor. All those opposed, keep your raise your hands, keep them raised until we got a good count. Okay, that's about 10, so that motion fails. Appreciate the good discussion, folks. Any further discussion on this invasive species topic? Before we move on, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I thought might be helpful for us is to hear from Extension at some point when we're discussing this issue and let them talk about the pesticide training program and just get the input from them as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep, that's a very good suggestion. I appreciate that. We can have them at our next meeting. Representative Larson.
Chairman, thank you. Is there any way to get a EPA, maybe somebody, a spokesman for them also? Yeah, it'd be nice to hear from them.
We can certainly try, Representative Larson, and we'll see what the result is. But otherwise, we'll continue to talk about them, whether they're here or not. Okay, committee, further discussion on this invasive species topic? Okay, seeing none, we'll take a 15-minute break, or let's just call it 10:50. Be back in your seats with your video on at 10:50. We'll take up our last topic for the day, which is animal abuse statutes. All right, folks, looks like it is 10:50. Go ahead and turn your cameras back on if you will. We'll get going on our last topic for today. Could be a rather in-depth one, so we'll go ahead and get started talking about animal abuse statutes. Our LSO has prepared a white paper, so Kayla, if you want to go ahead and get started, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So yes, I'm Kayla. I'll be doing the memo on animal cruelty statutes for everyone today. So the memo is essentially 3 topics. First, there's a detailed summary of animal cruelty law as well as livestock cruelty in Wyoming. There's also some information on diversion programs as well as procedural due process requirements. So the first section is the summary of Wyoming's animal cruelty statutes. Really, this is just one statute. It's Wyoming Statute 63203, and that prohibits cruelty to animals, household pet animal cruelty, aggravated cruelty to animals, and then there's also behavior that will be found to be a felony. So I've been calling that felony animal cruelty, despite the fact that it's not specifically called that in statute. So the first crime is cruelty to animals. The crime of cruelty to animals occurs if a person does several different things. It can occur if someone knowingly overrides an animal, drives an animal while it's overloaded, unnecessarily beats or injures an animal, or knowingly carries an animal in a manner that poses an undue risk of injury or death. Another crime of animal cruelty is if someone unnecessarily fails to provide food, drink, or protection from the weather, cruelly abandons the animal, or if it's clear there's an immediate, obvious, serious illness or injury, and the person fails to provide appropriate care. Finally, you can also be convicted of animal cruelty if a person is present at any place where an exhibition of fighting of dogs or fowl is occurring for amusement or gain. Even in that one section, you can see there's a lot of qualifiers and there's a lot of content just in that one crime. That occurs throughout the statute where there's a lot kind of tucked in there, and some of it seems to kind of overlap or say almost the same thing in a couple different ways. So you'll see that throughout the memo. So the next crime is household pet animal cruelty, and that occurs if a person keeps a pet in a manner that results in chronic or repeated serious physical harm to the pet, or keeps a pet confined in a manner that constitutes a public health hazard. The next crime is aggravated cruelty to animals, and so that occurs. This is one especially that there's some slight duplication. So aggravated cruelty occurs when a person owns, possesses, keeps, or trains fowl or dogs with the intent to allow the dog or fowl to engage in an exhibition of fighting with another dog or fowl, or knowingly permits or promotes any of those activities on premises the person owns. Similarly, if someone does that for gain, that's also aggravated cruelty to animals. So those provisions are duplicated, although one is for gain and one is if you engage in an exhibition of fighting. The third way you can be convicted of aggravated cruelty to animals is if a person shoots, poisons, or intentionally acts to seriously injure or destroy any livestock or domesticated animal owned by another person if the animal is on property where it's authorized to be present. And then felony animal cruelty. So there's kind of two main categories on that. The first is if someone takes any action that's under the aggravated cruelty to animals. So again, the dog fighting or fowl fighting, shooting, poisoning, or intentionally acting to seriously injure or destroy, if those actions result in the death or required euthanasia of an animal. The other felony animal cruelty is if a person knowingly and with intent to cause death or undue suffering, cruelly beats, tortures, torments, or mutilates an animal. There's also a general prohibition in Wyoming statute against destroying an animal by the use of a high altitude decompression chamber or a carbon monoxide gas chamber utilizing a gas engine. My understanding is those two particular ways are known to cause suffering and pain for an animal as it's being euthanized. So I assume that's the intent behind those specific prohibitions on destruction of animals. So then for punishment, if a person is convicted of a first offense of animal cruelty, household pet animal cruelty, aggravated animal cruelty, or of destroying an animal in one of the prohibited ways, it's a misdemeanor punishable by not more than 6 months imprisonment, a fine of $750, or both. If a person's convicted of a second offense of any of those, then that's a high misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment of not more than 6 months or a fine of not more than $5,000 or both. Finally, if a person is convicted of a felony for animal cruelty, that is of course a felony punishable by not more than 2 years imprisonment, a fine of not more than $5,000 or both of those. There are some additional punishments that aren't kind of the criminal punishment for it. And so in addition to the criminal punishments I just outlined, a court can also require, so if an owner is the person being convicted, the court can require that person to forfeit the animal. The court can also require a person to pay any and all reasonable costs associated with providing necessary food, water, vet attention, and treatment. And the court can also prohibit or limit the defendant's ownership, possession, or custody of animals as the court deems appropriate. So in addition to the criminal penalties, there are actions the court can take to recoup the cost of caring for an animal that's seized, and to limit the defendant's ability to interact with animals, own animals in the future. Statute also specifies several activities that are not considered animal cruelty. And so those are humanely destroying an animal, including livestock, the use of industry accepted agricultural and livestock practices, rodeo events, hunting, capture, killing, or destroying a predatory animal or other wildlife in a lawful manner, the use of dogs in the management of livestock, the use of dogs or raptors in hunting, and the training of dogs or raptors for any lawful purpose. So that's the section on animal cruelty. Should I pause for just a moment in case there are questions? No?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Committee, any questions so far? It looks like we're basically got through Title 6, which is the criminal code, of course, and it's an important distinction. We'll hear more about Title 11 here in a bit. But Representative Haley, you have a question.
I do, thank you. Kind of back on page 2 and the 5th bullet point, it'd be the 3rd one under aggravated cruelty to animals.
Okay.
It says that the last part of the sentence, owned by another person while the animal's on property where the animal's authorized to be present. And is there another statute somewhere that if you have trespassed livestock, it would prevent the owner of that property from killing that trespassed livestock? Surely it's not legal to shoot somebody's horse if it gets out.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haley, I don't know off the top of my head. I seem to remember, I think there's some specific provisions in law about what to do with a stray animal, like a stray, but I believe that's what you're referring to. I can look for that and see if I can send that along. I just don't remember that off the top of my head, but I think there is a specific, there is kind of a specific process if you are detaining someone else's livestock or something.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I believe that it's probably the brand inspection laws, but I wonder if it's something that should be coordinated or included or put or worded differently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just taking a quick note of that.
Okay, very good. Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I remember when we went through this on HB 235, care of animals, and there was a section in there where it said a person commits a felony, and there was a bunch of language there that was stricken, and it says it just went right to punishable by not more than 2 years, but it didn't really have a, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at my computer instead of the camera. So it had a section that doesn't really clarify, and so I don't know if it did it somewhere else, but it looked confusing when we did that bill. I voted against the final passage of that bill, but I can kind of see where the last question came from, and it looks like we really have a mess here. So I'm trying to figure that out. So maybe some clarification if the last bill we did caused some of these problems. Thank you.
And before, give our staff a little bit of time to think about the answer. That's, I think, Senator Bouchard, it's on a very important point, and part of the reason why we have this as an interim topic is that these statutes, frankly, are kind of a mess. And we have been dealing with it in a sort of piecemeal approach, where for the past few years, at least the past 5 years, I've been in the legislature where something terrible happens to an animal and we want to make it a felony. And of course, those bills are constructed without much consultation, without talking to our ag producers, and there's frankly kind of a disconnect there between those who have good intentions and want to protect the livelihood of animals, mostly household pets, but also without recognizing that we look at livestock a little bit differently from household pets. So yes, I think that is part of the reason why we're looking at these statutes. They are very piecemeal. And that's why we're taking a step back and taking a look at it and hopefully having a thoughtful approach to this topic. So with that, if anybody from LSO wants to try to answer that question as well, that'd be great.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure. I did not reread Care of Animals before the meeting today, so I'm not sure I can give a good answer on that without looking at that a little closer. It looks like the specific provision that Senator Bouchard is referencing, there was quite a bit of language removed. This would be subsection N, to kind of strip out some of that detail and just define how a felony is punishable. But I would need to look a little closer to see how that changed the law and give a better answer on that.
Okay, Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and I think that just also to add to this general conversation, I think it would be interesting to look and see, because I'm like what Representative Haley brings up. I'm not aware that there's any statutes that say, that allows somebody to shoot a horse or a cow that has wandered onto their property. I'm pretty certain, I don't have the statutes right in front of me, but I'm pretty certain that there is a provision that says that you can shoot a dog or dogs if they are harassing your livestock. But I think that just, I'm throwing that out there as food for thought for the broader discussion. And I just, Kayla brought this up a couple minutes ago, but the specific statute saying that that statute prohibits destroying an animal by the use of a high altitude decompression chamber or carbon monoxide gas chamber. I'm wondering if that was some form of accepted industry practice for certain animals back in the day. I don't know, and that at some point Wyoming decided that that was was not ethical and was cruel and decided to ban it. I only bring it up because that seems like a very specific method that was targeted in that statute. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I I do have a bit of a response to that, actually. So first of all, I found, so it's Title 11, Chapter 24 is about estrays. So that's just a reference. I'll still look into that a little closer. And Chairman Hunt, as to your question, I don't know the Wyoming history specifically. My knowledge comes from some of the guidance from the American Veterinary Medical Association publications. As of at least 2015, I got the impression, it seemed like in the past, people didn't realize that a decompression chamber was caused pain and suffering to the animals because there wasn't observable behavior or something to that extent. But then the more it was studied, they found out that that is painful and causes suffering to the animals. So I think you're right that in the past that was a more widely spread practice. I don't know exactly when that switched over though. All right.
Okay, any further questions or just general comments at this point before we continue with the LSO presentation? Okay, go ahead and proceed, Kayla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so as you noted, we went through the criminal provisions in Title 6. And so then in Title 11, specifically Wyoming Statute 1129-101 through 115 relates to the protection of livestock animals. So first of all, in those provisions, the first one seems pretty obvious. If you confine livestock, you need to care for them. You have to provide a sufficient quantity of wholesome food and water. Next, the statute defines torture and cruelty as every act, omission, or neglect whereby the willful and malicious infliction of pain or suffering is caused, permitted, or allowed to continue when there's a reasonable remedy or relief. Statute also then prohibits cruelty to livestock. This is a bit, just something you should be aware of. So while torture and cruelty are defined as the same thing, that's the only time torture is actually used in those provisions. So torture and cruelty is defined the same, cruelty is prohibited, but then torture isn't really used. So that might be something the committee would like to look at to see if torture is, if that's extraneous information, if that needs to be there, or how the committee would like, if the committee would like to address that. Statute also allows any peace officer, agent, or officer of the State Board of Agriculture to impound any livestock animal found abandoned, neglected, or cruelly treated. And that can be cruelly treated as defined in Wyoming Statute 63203, or cruelly treated as determined by a Wyoming licensed veterinarian or Board of Agriculture employed veterinarian. So there's several ways that someone could be found to be treating an animal cruelly. Some of that is less apparent on the face of the statute than others. So the punishment for violating these protection of livestock requirements is as follows. So if a person is convicted of refusing to provide sufficient food and water to confined livestock, the person is guilty of a misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment for not more than 6 months, a fine of not less than $100 or more than $750, or both a fine and jail time. If a person is convicted of a second offense of refusing to care for an animal they've confined, that's a high misdemeanor punishable by not more than 1 year imprisonment, a fine of not more than $5,000, or both. There's another punishment for any person that interferes with, obstructs, or resists enforcement of the prohibition on cruelty to livestock. That person could be fined not less than $200 nor more than $1,500. These next provisions, so similarly to the prohibitions on animal cruelty in the criminal code, there are additional punishments that can be done civilly as well. These kind of punishments and authorities also seem to be a bit duplicative and may benefit from committee consideration on how to kind of clarify or reorganize. So if an enforcement officer arrests a person and the person is in charge of the animals, the enforcement officer can take charge of the livestock and the vehicle, assuming the livestock are being transported in a vehicle, and can provide for the livestock until the owner takes possession. Then the board or local government that's providing for the livestock then has a lien on the livestock to pay the cost of the care. Next is for any livestock that's abandoned, neglected, or cruelly treated, the enforcement officer first has to give notice to the owner if the owner is known, and then can care and provide for the livestock until the animal is released or destroyed. The enforcement officer can also detain the livestock until the expenses have been paid, or have a lien on the animal and recover that in a civil action. Finally, if a livestock animal is impounded and the owner is cited under Wyoming Statute 63203, which is the cruelty to animals section, the owner must post a bond with the circuit court in the county where the livestock was impounded. The bond will pay for the care and provision of the animal. Then when the bond expires, the owner can post another bond, but if they don't, the board can dispose of the animal. The animal owner is fully liable for the costs associated with the final disposition, excuse me, as well as the care of the animal. So importantly, that last provision, if someone is cited under cruelty to animals, there does not seem to be a way for them to get that animal back. So if they've been found to neglect, now I lost track. So if they take those actions, there's no way that animal is coming back. The person is just posting a bond so that someone will care for it. And when that bond is used up, then the animal is disposed of.
And so, Kayla, just a quick question on that. Is that regardless of whether they're found guilty or not, that they're paying the entity regardless of the outcome of the case? And there's, in addition to there no being any method for them to regain ownership of their property?
I'm going to pull the statute just to be sure, Mr. Chairman. My recollection is, I mean, it just says if they're cited, if the owner is cited. So it seems a bit open-ended, that there's not maybe the final steps of a process that you'd expect, or maybe the intent was just, that's your only chance. if you're cited under those provisions, no more livestock for you, at least not the one that was impounded. So, and so that's Wyoming Statute 1129 114B. So it would be an owner whose livestock animals were impounded and then have been cited. Yeah, it doesn't, not posted. It just says if an owner is cited. I'm going to make a mark by that one it seems like there's some interest in that provision. I just put a star by it to return to at the committee's request. So similarly to the animal cruelty provisions, there's specific provisions in Title 11 as to what is not cruelty. And so those provisions say that the Wyoming industry accepted agriculture or livestock management practices or other commonly practiced animal husbandry procedures as defined in statute is not livestock cruelty. You may note that differs a little bit from what's stated in the animal cruelty statutes. So those provisions are slightly different. Also not livestock cruelty is a Wyoming licensed veterinarian treating a livestock animal as authorized by the Wyoming Veterinary Medical Practice Act, or any rodeo event employing animal care practices generally accepted within the rodeo industry. Also, humanely destroying a livestock animal is will not be considered cruelty. Again, the rodeo exception is a little different here as well from the animal cruelty statutes. The committee has probably caught on, but the way that those provisions are organized in this memo is not representative of how they're organized in statute. So that the memo was tried to be organized for clarity. So the next provisions are on diversion programs. This is a little bit shorter provision. We do have a representative for prosecuting attorneys that will be commenting as well. So diversion programs is the next section. Diversion programs allow someone to avoid a specific portion of criminal proceedings in favor of doing something different. So some typical diversion programs are juvenile court diversion programs, court supervised treatment programs, as well as statutory deferment programs. I understand recently that in Albany County, a new program was created to help college-aged individuals who kind of make a mistake in college, and the prosecutor doesn't want that to mar their record going forward in life. So the statutory programs are Wyoming Statute 713-301 and 713-302. Those authorize deferrals in some way. So for instance, in 713-301, that is a program where a first offender who is found guilty or pleads guilty to a misdemeanor can defer further proceedings and be placed on probation for a term of up to 36 months. So it would allow a person who's a first offender to forego that sentencing, be placed on probation, and then there are several other provisions required. So a person has to report to the court at least twice a year, abide by the law, not leave the state without court consent, pay restitution to victims, and any other probation term the court finds proper. But if a person completes that probation and the court finds that that person's rehabilitation is successful, the proceedings are dismissed. So no conviction will occur, the person is discharged from probation and court monitoring, and then they won't have that on their record. On the other hand, if a person, my understanding is that this is often called a 301, just because of the statutory provision. So if someone violates probation and they're on this 301 program, the court can enter an adjudication of guilt and then proceed to sentence the person or order a trial to proceed if guilt hadn't been established yet. So it's, as I said, it's kind of that second chance. It gives someone an option to adjust their behavior, prove to the court and the prosecutor that they're going to act differently going forward and be a law-abiding citizen. Wyoming Statute 713-302 is a little bit similar, but what that does, it can only occur, oh, excuse me, I meant on 713-301 for the first offenders, that can only be used once. And so that kind of rounds out what appears to be the intent of the program, that you're giving a first offender one chance to kind of get straightened out. So
and Caleb, before you proceed with that, that's for misdemeanor, so that would cover two of the potential punishments under the Title VI statutes. And so I just had a question under court supervised treatment. Does that include mental health counseling?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure. My understanding is that diversion programs, a big kind of piece of that is agreement between the prosecution and the defendant. I have not been a prosecutor in which diversion programs were used, so I'm just not 100% sure on that, kind of what the limits are. My guess is yes, but I would defer to our prosecutor that'll be on shortly.
Very good, thank you. I think that's at least something that's on my mind as we kind of work our way through this topic, and once again trying to get out of the cycle where we, if we keep on just making things felonies that we don't like, and maybe looking at doing something a little different, and maybe the ability to require somebody to go through some mental health treatment as a part of punishment, instead of just making every horrible thing we see with animal abuse a felony. That might be a more prudent path forward. So just like to throw that out for the committee's consideration as we delve into this very complicated topic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then the other deferral provision is just the next statutory section, 713-302. And it allows the court, after someone has been convicted, to suspend sentencing in favor of probation or a fine. So that's a little less generous to the defendant in terms of allowing them to avoid a conviction. So yeah, that's the kind of two statutory examples of diversion programs. I know in my experience, like for the juvenile court, that's a similar kind of program where a child that gets in trouble runs through the juvenile court system in which proceedings are closed, and then their record kind of resets when they turn 18. So that's just another quick example of those. Are there any other questions on that piece of it?
Okay, questions so far, committee? Okay, thank you. Please proceed, Kayla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the final provision in the memo is on procedural due process requirements. Due process requirements, there are two aspects to that, substantive and procedural. For this memo, I just stuck to procedural requirements because that seemed to be the more likely interest of the committee. If you want more on substantive, though, I could certainly go back and amend this. So for due process requirements, under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment in the US Constitution and Wyoming Constitution, Article 1, Section 6, a state cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What this means is that these rights are relative. So an individual has a right to life, liberty, and property, but the legislature has the police power, which requires the legislature to enact laws for the health, safety, comfort, moral, and general welfare of the people. So it seems that there could be a situation in which someone's right to life, liberty, and property conflicts with the legislature's ability to regulate for the health, safety, comfort, moral, and general welfare of the people. So what happens, the law anticipates that as well, of course. And so when that happens, the legislature just has to provide notice and an opportunity to be heard there just has to be a process before someone's deprived. It doesn't say the legislature can never deprive anybody of anything. But it also says the legislature can't deprive everybody of everything with nothing, with nothing to protect them. So if correctly conducted, a criminal court proceeding will meet those requirements. Someone who's being, convicted, or someone who's been charged with a crime will be given notice of the hearing, will go to trial or have a bench trial, have some sort of hearing in front of that judge, and have that opportunity to be heard. There are instances where if that's not properly done, certainly arguments could be made as to whether or not due process was fulfilled. But for the purpose of the memo, the assumption is that the court proceedings will occur correctly. So the other, I think especially important with these provisions, another requirement of due process is that a criminal statute must provide a reasonable degree of certainty as to the conduct prohibited. The Wyoming Supreme Court, you guys get the whole quote because I think it's a really good one. The Supreme Court has said, no one may be required at peril of life, liberty, or property to speculate as to the meaning of statutes. The court goes on to say, a statute which either forbids or requires the doing of an act in terms so vague that men of common intelligence must necessarily guess at its meaning and differ as to its application violates the first essential of due process of law. And that kind of goes back to the notice requirement, where if you don't know what the statute says, can you be convicted for violating it? Is it clear enough as written that someone will know what they can and can't do? And so that's, if that occurs, a court might find a statute unconstitutionally vague. That would be the term that they might use. And so in conclusion, that's kind of the end of the core of the memo. The statutes on animal cruelty are pretty lengthy. There's several crimes, punishments, and information on activities that aren't considered a crime in the criminal section, all in one statute. Additionally, so as you noted, Mr. Chairman, the diversion programs, at least for the misdemeanors, seem that it would apply to the animal cruelty cases as well. There doesn't appear to be any specific diversion programs for animal cruelty or livestock cruelty. But as you noted, it does appear that those others would apply. And then finally, just the due process requirements need to be met in rearranging statute or changing it. And I'm available for any questions.
Okay, any questions, committee? First of all, thank you, Kayla, for that excellent overview of a very complex and convoluted set of statutes. I think that makes it very clear for the committee what the significant task we have before us on this issue. So with that being said, committee, any questions? Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my question is, you know, I've looked at other states on these issues. There are states, even, believe it or not, even in the Golden State, very good protections for agriculture, and yet they have cruelty laws. I just think that maybe we need to look at some of the things that they've done that have real balance instead of this whole thing. I mean, we really got to work this whole thing. I think we should just make a whole new section where it needs to be and get rid of all this patchwork that we've done. And I think we can look at states that have really took the balance of both agriculture and cruelty laws and just really have been very specific instead of what we've done. So I think it's really necessary that we fix this. So I don't know if we can, I guess I have somewhat of a question here. Can we look at other states that have taken this and had a more balanced approach and maybe help us guide us into a better approach? I guess that would be my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think that the answer is obviously yes, Senator Bouchard. And in interest of full disclosure, I did send a link to the committee on some Idaho statutes that deal with the due process concerns, which I think are at least a good place to start. But obviously, that's just one element of a very a multifaceted issue with the due process concerns. But I think it's probably going to be the primary focus of this committee, but certainly not the only issue we have with these statutes. So, Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to that point, I think if we decide to move forward with this, it seems to me that we're almost looking at possibly two different bills here. One would be the clarification of due process, possibly based off of the Idaho statute that the good chairman sent out to everybody. And so, you know, a bill dealing with clarification of due process and, you know, at what point animals as private property can be seized and at what point they need to be returned, and so on and so forth. And then it would seem that there's almost needs to be a second bill to try and address as Senator Bouchard said, this patchwork of penalties and of definitions as to what is and is not animal cruelty, and the differences in how domestic pets are handled versus livestock and so on and so forth. And I know that of those two, the latter of that has a potential at least to really open a can of worms. And I think that I share the frustration in that there's just no real cut and dried, you know, reference to what should be done in the event of an animal cruelty case. It just seems to be just splattered everywhere. But I think that of those two, and I could be wrong in that requiring two bills, but I think that I would just throw that out there as a possibility. But anyway, of those two major issues, I think that the due process is what my suggestion that we look at first. I think that seems to be the issue that causes the most trouble that we see in the press and that we hear from constituencies about. So I think that is probably what needs to be addressed primarily. And then if we want to take it on, either in this interim or another, then we look at the haphazard patchwork of penalties and definitions themselves. So those are my thoughts, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to go back to where we were in 63203, if you look at what that section, it says a person commits cruelty to animals if he knowingly, and in that particular piece of legislation, we crossed out, in other words, struck, and with intent to cause death, injury, undue suffering. That's gone. And then the next section, unnecessarily beats or injures, is what's there now. We actually struck or cruelly beats, tortures, torments, injures. And all I'm saying is here there were some good intentions maybe brought by the bringer of that bill, but in the end we ended up with even more of patchwork. And so you don't even know if there's any intent there. It just, I mean, it just makes it so ambiguous that how does someone even defend themselves if they didn't do something wrong? I mean, anyway, it really does need all straightened out. But anyway, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we didn't hear you on that one.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Any further additional comment or initial comment, I should say, committee members, as we begin to wrap our minds around these statutes? Okay. Okay, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would tend to agree with Chairman Hunt that this is an extremely comprehensive subject if we tackle the whole thing. So the due process part, I'm in agreement with tackling. I would also just bring up the fact that we have an election that will bring on a possibly, maybe not all, but some new faces to our committee as we go into a general session. And having been through that before, all of us coming in as newly elected, it's a pretty big subject to dump in someone's lap when they're just newly elected, if this committee were to change. But that would be all I would comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. I mean, I agree with the general sentiment that we can have at least two bills and maybe more, focusing on the due process issues, which seem to be on the front burner, but also, maybe I think I smell a working group coming on potentially, not to preclude any discussion as to other options, but certainly lots of complex issues. But I think that's something that we can handle if we have the proper input from not just the constituencies involved, but also from our legal community. That's going to be incredibly important moving forward. So I do have a question for Kayla on the due process issue. It looks like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but we're going back to the bond posting for livestock that's impounded. There's a reference to Title 6, but I was just wondering if there's a similar process for how that is handled in Title 6, perhaps with animals that are not livestock. How do we deal with impounding other animals? And that's the other issue we have to be aware of, committee. We're going to be hearing from animal shelters that are kind of stuck with the costs as these cases are processed. And so that might be some opportunity for clarity there and as part of that due process conversation. So just a question for Kayla. Is there a similar provision in Title 6 for posting of bonds, or is there any consideration as to what happens in that interim period as for while that case is being disposed of, who pays for the care of those animals outside of livestock?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If my memory serves me correctly, Yes and no. So there is not a similar provision about posting a bond in Wyoming Statute 63203. It does similarly allow for there to be a lien on the animal. And I believe it's an immediate lien where you don't need to jump through too many hoops to get it. But having a lien on the animal, that might necessitate legal costs. So my understanding is that whoever is caring for the animal is paying for it. And then that money is recoverable in a civil action or through the lien process against the owner. But whether that final step does or can occur very easily, I'm not too sure about how that process really shakes out.
Okay, I believe there's some reference in Title 29 to those lien procedures, which do include animals. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, do you mean, is there a reference in title or in 1129 to Wyoming Statute 63203?
No, it looks like Title 29, completely different title where we deal with liens. That might be another area for the committee to be aware of because that deals specifically with liens. I think that's the mechanism we have now, whether it's adequate or not is an open question, but that's the mechanism that we have now to recover these costs from an individual who had their animal taken from them while there's an open question whether they're treating that animal correctly.
Mr. Chairman, for the most part, I'll be honest, the punishments in the protection of livestock animal section that is not the criminal punishment, it gets a little confusing. So for like one specific, so if the livestock animal is abandoned, neglected, or cruelly treated, then in addition to the lien, the essentially enforcement officer can also detain the animal so they can physically hold the animal. But that seems to be the only place that that's allowed as well. So it's a little less clear exactly what actions allow for which punishments in terms of the non-criminal punishments. So I think that just gets a little tricky in that piece as well. Like I said, for the most part, you're correct, it's the lien, but then there's that one little provision where you can also detain the livestock.
Okay, any further questions, committee? Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and continue down the agenda. Making a slight adjustment, I believe we have Senator Ogden Driscoll with us. Give him an opportunity to sort of speak first, if he's out there. Senator Driscoll, I did allow you at least into this Zoom meeting. So if you're listening, we'd like to give you an opportunity to comment at this time.
Mr. Chairman, I've not seen him in the waiting room.
Right, he was in the waiting room, then I let him in, and now I don't see him at all. Okay, well, we'll look forward to hearing from Senator Driscoll at some point today. So short of that, we'll go ahead and go with Director True. You are up next. Obviously, you're going to be dealing with the Title 11 portion of these statutes. Look forward to hearing your perspective.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me well? Thank you, sir. If I could real quickly, I'd like to touch on a couple of the questions and comments earlier on. One, I'd like to thank LSO. They've done a yeoman's job of digging through these statutes. They are fairly scattered and spread out, but I want to note one thing. Kaylee commented about the Department of Ag being involved, and they are not. That's us. The Livestock Board is the board referred to in these statutes. Second, in regards to Representative Haley's question and comment about livestock that may be on your property, there is in our stray statutes, section 1124-107 speaks of liability for death of an stray animal that may have come on your property. And there is no liability for that person unless the death is a result of mistreatment or willful neglect. in which case the animal cruelty statute then supersedes that estray having come onto your property. If there's been abuse or willful neglect, now that animal that strayed onto you is now subjected that person, the stray receiver, to potential animal cruelty charges. One other comment I'd make quickly, and I would get there in a little bit as I talk about how we teach due process to the agencies on this practice, but the reference to the cost of care bond and no ability to return that property is not quite correct. It's correct to a certain level, but that cost of care bond is instituted to protect the agency from fiscal damage while they're feeding what could be a substantial seizure. So if the person posts that bond throughout the case, the time that the case is being tried, they may very well find that that case is in their favor and livestock is returned at that time. So that bond is just there for the care of the livestock during that case. Where we get involved, because our estray statute is involved there, if that person, say, has their livestock seized due to neglect or lack of care and feed, they're cited under 63203B, and the cost of care bond is filed. They fail to post that bond or they forfeit that ability, then our estray statutes allow us to become the mechanism that disposes of that animal for the agency that seized them. So that's how that works. In order to, for an example, if an agency at the local sheriff's office seized 50 head of horses, their first redress would be to file that citation and then get that cost of care bond hearing in 10 days and allow that owner to either post the bond or forfeit. If they forfeit, then we can sell them through the estray statute. Now, something that I would note, that owner is still available to buy that livestock back because it's going to a public auction. So there's another place to get their livestock back. But that's the part of the cost of care bond. It's there for 1129-114 is there basically to protect the agency, the seizing agency, from a fiscal damage due to having to pay cost of care for those animals. 1129.
Director True, just so I understand that. So this is before the trial takes place. There's no finding of guilt or innocence, but it's possible for that person to lose possession of their property?
Well, that's part of the due process, but if we'll say that they've gone through 3 or 4 visits, care has not improved, and the agency determines that the animals need to be seized, then they will have a bond hearing. That they may lose their property if they forfeit the bond, or if they lose the case, the adjudicating court may tell them they can't have them anymore. But there is always the possibility they may win their case and they would have their animals returned to them by the agency that did the seizure.
Would they have their bond refunded if they're found to be not guilty of that crime?
Mr. Chairman, that bond is going to go towards whoever is providing the feed and care. So that entity, be that the sheriff's office, be that animal control, be that the livestock board at our property here in Cheyenne, if we're holding that animal, then we're made well on our feed costs while we held that animal during the adjudication of the case. That's where the bond goes.
Thank you for that clarity.
There's
Any
also
further questions, committee? Sorry, just Representative Hunt, did you have something, or were you? Okay, all right. Okay, go ahead. Please continue, Director True.
Okay, and there's also 1129-110, which is the liens. That allows the agency to file a civil action, which is not always the best avenue to compensate or reimburse them for those costs of care, those same costs of care. However, they may do that in cases of abandon, as Kayla mentioned, where maybe the owner isn't known. They may file a lien until that owner is determined, and then they would enact the lien upon that person to pay for the same costs of care. So those are two places in our statute, in our statutes in Title 11, that I just wanted to clear that up, that it's not guaranteed that they won't get their livestock back. They may very well. So having said those things, I want to just jump in quickly to talk about how we teach which is what our role is at this time with only one investigator and starting to recruit a second, but training is our best availability to the sheriff's agencies, who are usually the agencies involved in these cases. So we talk a lot about, I provided the committee some information, but we talk a lot about in our trainings about due process and about being able to determine what you're looking at upon first call. If an officer comes to a place where there's been a report of of starving animals, we've given them a scoring chart to be able to make a rudimentary guess on what those animals' condition is, followed up if they have any question to always get a veterinarian. A local veterinarian in most cases is the best available. In certain cases, we can apply one of our state veterinarians for an eyes-on or a confirmation of the local veterinarian's diagnosis. But we always ask that they do those couple things first. And then as they go in to interview the folks involved, to always understand that there's really two types. There's a passive cruelty, which is that people don't know. They don't have experience with their livestock. And I'm just going to talk about livestock. We don't deal with pets. The only livestock with a canine would be a guard dog. In certain cases falls in our purview or these statutes purview. But they would go in and they would need to understand that maybe the person doesn't know. Maybe they don't have any experience with livestock. They've just purchased the acreage, walked all the grass off, didn't buy any hay, and now the horses are thin. So they need to talk to them about that and look and see, are all the horses poor? You know, there's always a conversation to be had there. So this one horse is thin, the rest are not. Is he older? Did you just get him? Have you had his teeth done? All of those kind of questions will lead that officer in a discretionary pattern, just as he would in almost any initial contact, to say, okay, this is a case of where we're probably going to have to educate and follow up, and maybe condition improves. So there's the bulk, the very largest group of our cases are passive cruelties, where the folks either don't know or they've had the horse for 30 years and now he's really looking poor and they just aren't able to make the decision they need to make. And so the agencies will bring us in to advise and consult in some of those, and we can get to the end action that's necessary. Now, there's also egregious aggressive cruelty. And that's a case where you're likely going to find an immediate seizure with animals that are in horrible condition or being tortured or being beaten, as the statutes say. And in those cases, a lot of times they can be seized or impounded in place quickly for an investigation with a veterinarian to come take a look and work at it that way. Something we always think that education is first, and a quick follow-up to see if there's improvement, and we teach the due process that way. The last thing we want to do is take somebody's property if there's not a need. And we coach that, train that with the sheriff's agencies as well, and they work under search and seizure, property seizure laws, due process laws every day. So that is something they're used to dealing with. There's also the ability to surrender. You know, if that person has that older horse that they just can't make the decision with, they can surrender that animal to the livestock board. We'll do a change of ownership to ourselves, and we'll either we'll dispose of the animal in one of the methods available to us through either the stray statutes, through euthanasia, or in some cases, those animals are picked up by other folks that will rescue them. So those are always things that we treat. You'll notice in our handout on page 2 about confiscation of an animal, we teach you always have law enforcement and a veterinarian available. We preach photographs because it doesn't take long to change the condition as an animal, as most of you on this committee are aware. A little good feed, green and grass for 10 days, and it's a whole different looking piece of evidence in those cases where it's been done. So those are that's a quick and overview version of how we teach that, but we teach due process over and over and over. Make sure you have an animal health expert veterinarian to back up your diagnosis or your conclusions. and work at it that way, that seizure should be, in the vast majority of cases, not a first option. It's a later option, a third or fourth option. So that's the due process part that we preach there. I would say that one of the difficulties we have, and God bless our law enforcement, and particularly in today's climate, they're between us and them at all times. But we have a lot of folks anymore in today's world that aren't extremely versed in livestock practice or livestock conditions, and even livestock law, and sometimes making the jump from 63203 over to 1129 is not a jump they are experienced in making. But I want to make sure that the committee understands that there's a gradual way to cite those cases too. You can cite under 1129-103 for mistreatment of an animal or lack of feed, which is a $250 bond. The bonds then you can jump it up then to a 63203, which first offense is a minimum $550. There's some new bond schedules coming July 1st, and that's the price I'm quoting on those. And then you can step into the high misdemeanor and then into the felony. So there's opportunities even through enforcement action to stair step those cases if enforcement is necessary. I would anecdotally give reference to several sheriffs in the state who are highly attuned to their producer base or their local base, that oftentimes that first visit and that I'll be back in 2 weeks conversation is enough. And so I want to make sure and share that with the committee. That all being said, that would probably complete my quick presentation. I wanted to touch on one other thing. You asked about the cost of care bonds for domestic pets. I'm not 1,000% how this works, but in section O is the cruelty to household pets protection account held by the Attorney General's office. But I think that fund is used to offset some agencies' potential fiscal liability due to the seizure or care of animals they may have taken into their custody. Mr. Chairman, I'd try to answer any questions that the committee has.
Thank you, Director. I appreciate it. If I remember correctly, that program in that O section of Title VI is voluntarily funded through donations. So yeah, it would certainly something that the committee needs to be aware of, but we'll see, probably hear from the animal shelter folks to see whether that's useful or not. And just a quick note, when we're talking about due process, I don't want to be, talking past each other. When at least I reference due process, I'm not talking about the process of gathering evidence or the process you're discussing and leading up to potentially a citation. I'm talking about once that citation has occurred and those animals have been impounded, what rights does the person at this point accused of a crime and deprived of their property have to retain ownership of that property until they're actually convicted of a crime. So just want to make sure that we're not talking past each other when it comes to that concept of due process. So that being said, Chairman Hunt, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Drew, you said that in the vast majority of cases, seizure is not the first option. In your experience, then, in how many cases do you end up having to seize the animals after repeated visits or repeated encounters?
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Hunt, I would just have to ballpark it. And over the last 3 years, those have been all almost strictly county actions. But in many cases, and I hate to convolute the process anymore. In many cases, there may be other charges. Somebody may be having a few horses and several dogs taken away because they're locked away on a drug charge. So there could be extenuating circumstances to that. As far as animal husbandry or animal cruelty alone, I would say, without going back through records and visiting with our other counterparts in law enforcement, I would say 10% or would result in a seizure at some point.
Chairman Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director True, and because I'm, certainly aware that we've, this committee and the legislature have helped with it to try and get this more over the last several years into the purview of the sheriff's offices. So perhaps Mr. Odekoven, when he comes on, may want to, expound on that a little bit too, if he has any information. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few comments. Number one, Director True, I really appreciate your approach to trying to educate before you confiscate. I think that's a good policy. There's a lot of folks out there that probably don't know exactly what they should be doing. The other comment I would make is that there's a reason why there's a statute 6 and a statute 11, because 11 is dealing with livestock, 6 is dealing with pets, is my guess. I think we want to be careful here as we go treading into areas where we need not be there. Mr. Chairman, I think your point about the rights of the individuals, if they haven't been convicted, is a good one. But I think we want to tread carefully as we move forward here.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, go ahead, Director.
I appreciate Senator Moniz's comment. We typically deal with just section B, 63203B on cruelty if you have charge in custody, and not necessarily to provide with feed and water. The rest of Title 6, unless you get into that shooting of an animal, typically doesn't involve us. And that's something I wanted to touch on too. Some of that statute for an animal being shot or poisoned on its own property has to do with some of the animal activities that have happened, particularly in other states and ours as well, where livestock has been killed on an activist level, or a guard dog shot because they get too close to a property line, those sorts of things, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any further questions for the Livestock Board? Okay, I see none at this point. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's about noon, so we're about halfway down our scheduled presenters here. We're going to hear from the chiefs and our sheriffs and chiefs of police, as well as the county attorneys. But I think at this point it's prudent to take a break, but we'll check with both Byron and Diana just to make sure that works for them. Appreciate their expertise and their coming to this committee. So just we'll double check before we break for lunch, make sure if we take a break and come back at 1 o'clock, that works for them. So if we
Mr. Chairman, if that was a question for Byron, the answer is yes. I'm at your disposal today.
Okay, we appreciate that, Mr. Odekoven, and we'll wait for Diana Bennett, who's a Sheridan County attorney, to get here. And Ms. Bennett, we're just wondering if I had a question about the schedule. We're ready to break for lunch, but certainly want to respect your time as well, and really appreciate you being here to talk to us. Just wondering if we broke for lunch and came back at 1, if that would work for you.
This is Diana. I actually have a court hearing at 1 o'clock. I think Mr. Odekoven wanted me to go before him.
Okay, well, glad we asked the question. So we'll go ahead and press on and hear from the representative from the county and county attorneys.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't think I know very many of you, so I'll give you a little bit of information about myself. I've been a prosecutor for 20 years. I was a defense attorney for 3 years prior to that. And my husband's a rancher, so here in Sheridan County. So I kind of have a little bit of experience on all sides of this. From what I've been hearing, a lot of the concern from this committee seems to be some of the due process issues. And I guess I can just start with that. As Mr. True had just said, it's actually very rare. I mean, my 20 years here, it's very rare to seize livestock for animal cruelty cases. Any case I've ever had is a pretty aggravated case. 2 of them, the horses actually did die of starvation. I just haven't had a case where law enforcement's going out, or the brand inspectors or anybody's just going out and seizing animals, mostly because it's really expensive. We really don't have anywhere to put them. It's hard for everybody. And there is the stair-step approach, and it seems to have worked well. You know, the conversations with the owners of the animals, you know, continue to go out and checking and seeing how they're doing. Only when it's a pretty aggravated case, like the animals are starving, are they seized. And I can't think of one case I've had where that's not the case. So the bond that's been discussed in 1129-114, it is just a bond, just like a criminal defendant has to post a bond to get out of jail. They get that money back if they show up for court. In this case, they don't necessarily get it back because someone's got to be taking care of these animals, whether it's the landowner who would be going through the expense of the animal, of taking care of the animals, or whoever's the custodian at the time. If there's money left over, they would get that back. So it is just for the cost of the animal. It's not any kind of punishment or punitive aspect to that statute. It's I did hear some of the previous testimony. I would note under that statute, and I believe 2011, it did provide for a bond for pets and animal cruelty cases as well. I don't know if it was the legislature changed that, which I actually contacted my legislators. Senator Burns actually tried to get that changed back because as the animal shelters will tell you, it's also costly for them. The animal cruelty cases for the pets are obviously more, a bit more common, and that also costs money. Sometimes if they're in custody for 6 months before a trial's had. So someone's paying for the cost for those. And it used to be provided under that statute, and it's not any longer. So I wasn't really happy about that because we used to do that, and our circuit court judge used to order those bonds. But I think what I'm sensing here is a big concern about the due process for the owners of the livestock. And I know that there was a recent case in Campbell County, which probably brought a lot of this to the forefront. But from my experience, you know, I don't think that there needs to be a big concern from this committee. But just keep in mind, these animals are evidence. They are evidence. When somebody shoots somebody, we seize the gun. It's evidence. They don't get it back unless, you know, a lot of things happen. They're found not guilty, or they even may get it back if it's killing something else, or if it's threatening somebody with a gun. They will eventually probably get that firearm back if they're not a convicted felon. But you seize it because it's evidence of the crime. And so you have to, even though they're animals, they are evidence of the animal cruelty. Part of seizing them is to also see if they have any medical issues that prevent them from gaining weight. If we seize them and they start gaining weight immediately, we know that it wasn't a medical problem that this livestock had. So that's a good reason for the seizure. Again, it's not to be punitive. It's, well, one, if they're not feeding them and the animal's starving, we got to get the animal safe. And so that's one of the reasons of seizure, but it is a last resort. I don't want this community to think, at least from my experience, that law enforcement doesn't take this, they take it seriously. Nobody wants to be seizing these animals because, quite honestly, it's really hard to take care of them, and it's really hard place to find where to put them. I heard some of the previous testimony as well for the deferred, what do we do with some of these people? Well, if they're cases of not feeding or providing animal or water, it's an education process. I think more often than not that I've seen it's don't have the money. They have animals that they can't pay for. Obviously that's not cattle so much. I mean, who wants to starve their cattle? And it's a silly idea because you're not going to make money. So most of these cases that I've had are horses. There's no, if they don't have a lot of money or they don't have a lot of incentive to buy hay, buy grain, whatever they need, these horses need, and they're just not properly cared for. It doesn't happen a lot with cattle. I haven't had a cattle case ever. So a lot of times it's just they don't have the money for it. So they can't post the bond because they don't have the money in the first place. If they had the money, they probably would have been taking care of them. So that's where we always offer, if you just can't, if you can't take care of this animal and we avoiding kind of prosecution, how about if you just relinquish rights to this animal? You can't afford to take care of. Horses are expensive. And so we always look at those kinds of options as well. Now the animal cruelty, like the causing pain, torture of an animal, that's kind of a whole different situation. And there's obviously more need to seize an animal in that circumstance because that person is harming the animal intentionally, or that's our allegations. And so of course, seizing the animal makes more sense in those situations. What to do with that person is a whole different conversation. It's not a person that just isn't educated or doesn't have money. It's a person that there's something maybe not quite right with them. And so, the prosecution goes a whole different way. As far as 713-301, I heard the LSO representative talk about doing deferred prosecutions, and she mentioned that 713-301 is for misdemeanors. It's also for felonies. I don't think she read that part in there. We do deferreds for felonies quite often, and it's in that same part of that statute. So a person doesn't necessarily you get one. So if you use it for a DUI, you've used it. You only have one. So a lot of people try to keep one in case they want to try to get it on a felony. But in subsection A, it does include felonies. It just excludes violent felonies, and well, it's kind of a long statute, but so a person convicted with or charged with a felony, including felony animal cruelty, can possibly, if a prosecutor agrees to it, get that special treatment of 713-301. But I don't really know, I don't know really what brought this up. I know these statutes are a mess. But prosecutors do recognize the two different, we do recognize the livestock versus the pets. And it's just quite easier when they're not feeding their animals to prosecute under that, under Title VI, because it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that perspective. It's a very important one as we or tread in areas of the statute which this committee is not generally associated with, especially Title VI. But I certainly appreciate that perspective. And so just in terms of the due process concerns, we are kind of looking at these Idaho statutes, which basically have a provision in them if there's no probable, in the instance where there is no probable cause, if the court finds there is no probable cause, and if later that if that defendant is found to be not guilty, then they are not responsible for paying the bond. And would that be a reasonable provision as sort of a catch-all, just to, in these instances, like I think we're all thinking about, like the one in Campbell County where somebody's livestock is sold because they don't post a bond, but then they're found not guilty. Do you think that'd be a good provision to add just to make sure that we're covered.
And that it be reimbursed. I mean, I think the purpose of the bond is to care for the animals while it's pending. And in that case, the case that, it played out, and, still the animals had to be cared for during the time. The owner certainly would have had to, at some point, spend some money for feed for these animals. So, I mean, how do you say that whoever's got custody of the animals while the case is pending, or those were sold, right? Some of them were just sold, and I've never heard of that before. I've never done that. We've always held the animals in a place while the case is pending and not disposed of them. But the whole point of the bond is to take care of the animals while it's pending. So I guess what you're asking would for it to be repaid. And I don't know
if the defendant is found not guilty, to be clear, only under that circumstance. So
that would make sense. I'm not sure exactly who would repay it, because the custodian isn't necessarily involved with the case. The custodian might be someone that we found with some facilities for the animals. So if there, some sort of, I don't know exactly where that money would come from, but that would make sense. The owner of the animals still did benefit from somebody taking care of their animals during that time.
Yep, that's clearly understood, I think, and we're looking at just going through the Idaho statute. There's costs associated with the seizure, care, or treatment, and certainly you can bifurcate different types of costs. So whether it's going to be a cost that would happen no matter what, like with feed, or whether there's additional costs that may be more elective to take care of the animal. So
that would make sense. And Mr. Chairman, I guess I would just reiterate. I know that there was that case and that happened, and I think there was some. I obviously wasn't the prosecutor on that, but I read the case. I did get the reports from the sheriff, and I wanted to educate myself on that case. And I think there was some different factors, a third party involved with this case that kind of confused it. But that I think is a rare, very rare situation. So I don't know that, obviously it is your concern, but I don't know if it needs to be your concern when case comes along. And I know people contact their legislators, or you hear about something that happened and then think that things need to be changed on a grand scale. I think you're probably not going to see something like that in a very long time. And if you try to address every statute for a fluke situation, you're kind of chasing down a rabbit hole there. But I certainly understand the chairman's concern. I don't think it's a big problem, and I don't think it will be a big problem.
I appreciate that comment, and certainly the challenge would be, like I kind of described it, as a fail-safe or a catch-all in those instances where the system doesn't work without affecting the vast majority of cases, as we've been hearing from you, Ms. Bennett, as well as Director True. That would be the committee's challenge, make sure we don't mess up a process that is working while still providing that fail-safe for our citizens. So committee members, any questions for County Attorney? Any questions at all? This is pretty important testimony here, folks. Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your experience, have you had, when it comes to animal cruelty, as far as hoarding is concerned, I guess what I'm wondering is when there are animal abuse cases and lumping in neglect and so on and so forth, is it typically, in your experience, the case that they either do not have the means or the capacity to properly take care of an animal, or is it more malicious, psychopathic, crazy people who are intentionally causing harm? And because I guess understanding, every so often you see these cases where, authorities find 200 cats in some house, and in that case, the caretaker, quote unquote, sometimes seem to genuinely believe that they're trying to do what's best for the animals, and that they honestly, it's almost a mental illness. They can't get their head around the fact that those animals are suffering from neglect. So I just wondered in general what your experience is in cases like that, or what the facts of those cases tend to be.
And those cases, we've had some with cats here, not on a big scale. I've received emails from county attorneys around the state because I wanted to get some more information for purposes of today. And there's been those cases around the state, and I think sometimes they've prosecuted for the cruelty, not trying to throw anybody in jail, but basically as a way to one thing to stop the behavior, because a lot of times those cases people have intervened numerous times. Most times those cases do involve some sort of mental illness, and the idea of everybody is just to get those animals out of their care. Sometimes part of their mental illness is they don't want to let go of that, and so it's kind of a vicious circle, and sometimes that's how you actually have to move forward is to go forward with the case and use the case as a way to get the animals out of the care. But yeah, the last case we had in this office was a domestic violence type thing where the boyfriend stabbed his girlfriend's dog with a kitchen knife while it was in its carrier, killed it. We've had another domestic violence case where they killed a cat to hurt the significant other. Those are obviously your epitome of animal cruelty cases. And we look to punish people that are doing that much differently than the person that is just more neglectful. I think we and the courts and the judges, we all take a lot of time and effort to look at the individual problems of these people. If they need counseling, the people that are stabbing dogs because it's a domestic violence situation is that guy is probably gonna get up his ante if he already hasn't. And we really need to intervene with that person, because that's probably a pretty damaged person that's going to hurt somebody else. We see those are actually pretty common, the cruelty to animals in a domestic violence situation. So yeah, we use our best discretion. We don't want to prosecute somebody if we just think that they're hoarding because they think they're caring for these animals and they can't stop. We do everything we can to get involved. We have a local cat rescue. We have the shelter that goes in and tries to help these people. So no one wants to prosecute a mentally ill person. We just want to get those animals out of their care. And there is the knowingly aspect of the animal cruelty statute. I heard some talk about it. There is, it's the actual cruelty part is that you're knowingly doing it. And so that's why, as Mr. True explained, we educate people and say this: you're not taking care of your animal correctly. Your animal's very thin. In fact, we get vets out there and get involved. They score the animals. We try to, the whole system tries to educate people. It's only, especially as to that livestock, it's only after, after repeated tries that I think that anybody wants to do anything. And as far as the differences between pets and livestock, maybe there's been a prosecution out there, but I've never heard of it. You dehorn cattle, you pull calves, you hook up to chains and you pull out calves, and you band cattle or you band steers, well, becoming steers, you band bulls. I've never heard anybody prosecuting any, for the different livestock practices. So I don't think this committee needs to be concerned about that. we're here in Wyoming and we're all pretty educated on, I mean, maybe me more than others since I'm married to a rancher, but you know, we understand the difference between livestock and pets, and we're not prosecuting people for doing livestock, you know, dehorning or things like that. We do realize that there's a difference, and I've never even had a case that came forward to me like that, because everybody understands the difference.
Okay, any further questions, committee? Okay, one more before you go. There's some discussion about, in addition to the misdemeanor and felony charges, you know, there's this idea out there that we allow the courts to basically require mental health counseling. Just is that already an option available to the court, or would it benefit from having a statutory program that defines that this is an option in some cases?
I think if it's obvious that there's a mental health, you know, issue, I think we just automatically do that. I don't really think it has to be mandated. There's different situations in these cases. There's the, you know, I heard you say you don't want to make everyone felons. Well, the reality is it has to be pretty bad before it's a felony, and it's a 2-year felony. I mean, if I write a check, if I write $1,001 worth of bad checks, it's a 10-year felony. But if I torture an animal to death, it's a 2-year felony. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think the punishment I don't think that it's overdone here. They are property, but again, if you scratch somebody's car and it requires $1,001, you could go to prison for 10 years, but you could literally torture an animal to death for a week and you can only face 2 years. So I don't think that the statutes are overkill. Only when an animal is really tortured or dies from starvation or something does it even a felony possibly kick in. And when someone's doing that, yes, there's that mental health, you know, we can get them mental health counseling, but some people, I mean, if someone's doing that to an animal, I don't know that taking a class is really going to help them. As far as what we saw on the, I was looking through the LSO's paperwork, there's what kind of different programs are there. It's, you know, there's a special statute for controlled substances, because being convicted of a controlled substance, just marijuana under federal law can take away your federal aid for college. So there's a special statute that you can get not convicted under, it's called 35-7-1037 or 713-301. You can avoid convictions, and we do that a lot. I don't think that there needs to be any kind of special treatment for animal cruelty, because there's not really for anything else. There's drug court for addicts, and there's deferreds for what we just discussed, and there's a special deferred statute for controlled substances to prevent kids from losing their financial aid. But I don't think that there's really any reason to make any special law or for this kind of case, just like any kind of other, you know, any kind of property destruction. You know, somebody goes destroy somebody's property, we're not making them do any special treatment. And that's what this is. This is basically somebody's property, but there's a different aspect of it. For animals, they're property, but we also have ethical issues, and so it's a little bit different.
Absolutely. So Representative Tass, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Bennett, for what, even though our laws, animal cruelty laws are scattered throughout, apparently through some of this, some of the regulations, whatever, would you say is there any big hole that needs to be fixed in our statutes to prevent animal cruelty, or an improvement there, or are the laws still working pretty good and covering most of the bases? And for the abuses, it's there. Maybe our laws need to be cleaned up, but for the most part, would you say, or would you indicate there's some real need someplace to change some of our laws? Thank you.
No, not really. It seems like a jumbled mess because there's a Title 11 and Title 6, but I think this committee understands pets are different than livestock. And so you really have to have two different kind of statutes. These cases are actually pretty hard to prove. They're not, they're cases that are hard to prove, and again, we don't hear about cases, even with pet cases, that we just don't get involved. We don't ever even have them reported unless it's pretty aggravated. So by the time we get these cases, it's pretty bad usually. I mean, I just don't get a bunch of animal cruelty cases where I say, oh, that's not that bad, I'm not going to prosecute it. Usually it's an animal that's really hurt or stabbed or pretty starving. I mean, like body scores are 1 or 2 before we get involved in this office. And then, then we get involved. There's no real holes. Some of the statutes, as you were discussing earlier, are kind of confusing. If an animal doesn't know it's trespassing, there's a fence out state. So what do you do when your livestock are going to somebody else's pastures? And yeah, if you look at the statute that this committee was reading, can you shoot your neighbor's cow if it's on your property? Well, no, that's somebody else's property. You're going to be liable to them for the damage of their property. But why is that written in there like that? I don't know. It's kind of confusing to me too. So there's some statutes I think that need to be cleaned up, but I don't see any big holes as far as what I do. We see maybe 1 or 2 cases in a whole year. It's just not a kind of crime that we deal with a lot. And when we do, it's usually a pretty aggravated circumstance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one question that just popped up. Might sound kind of crazy, but when does livestock become a pet in the minds of the courts? My horses, I'll be honest with you, they're just about as much of a pet as they are livestock. I use them for both. So I just wondered.
Well, I don't know. We haven't had a situation where we really had to bring that up. I think if it falls under the definition of livestock in the statutes, then it's livestock. Even if it is a pet. My dad had a horse for 30 some years and it was his pet, but it was, as far as all this is concerned, it's not. So, that's what those definitions are for.
Okay, further questions, committee? Okay, thank you. Appreciate your time, Ms. Bennett. It's good to hear from the prosecutor's perspective, and certainly glad to have at least one attorney, of course, outside of our very capable LSO staff here testifying from the folks that actually have to implement the statutes that we write. So appreciate your time, and I imagine that we'll be in contact moving forward.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, it's 12:30, so we'll go ahead, unless somebody has a really burning issue, we'll go ahead and break for lunch until 1:30. So just plan on being back at 1:30 and we'll finish out this topic.